One thing I did get from the commentary is that so much of this that you would think is maybe accidental or is a matter of interpretation coming retrospectively is actually very, very, very conscious indeed.
Well, I did watch an interview with the crumbs. Is it Richard Broke who produced it, or executive producer?
Oh, I can't remember off the top of my head.
I will have to. I'd better pull that up on my computer because if I refer to him, I want to get his name right. And I found an interview with him, and yeah, I mean, this was not just pulled out of their arse.
No, oh my God, no.
No, they spend a lot. His working at Broke and the producer Ruth Baumgarten, they were really applied to this. This wasn't just some brief that came along and they went, oh yeah, okay, well, all right.
Not at all. No, well, Ruth is on the commentary. Ruth is actually on the commentary.
Over by I mean, their careers were destroyed by Ghostwatch.
I mean, for a work so bloody typical BBC,
right? A work of utter genius, a work that actually is like a unique experiment that actually shifts people off their asses and makes them feel something.
It's so typical BBC that it's absolutely brilliant. It's like the culmination, really, before it dies, of this great strain that we've talked about before, the BBC Gothic, the BBC Uncanny.
Yeah. Absolutely.
This
you
last
see the DNA.
Moment, can't
you? I mean, that's what I love
we're going
about.
to do this, but it's this last moment, and it's a masterpiece. It's a crowning glory, right? Yeah. And it happens almost by accident with this little pocket of people acting, and they get it through because
nobody knows what they're doing.
This is still the old BBC where there are these little pockets where people aren't supervised and aren't micromanaged, and there isn't this hegemonic ideological sort of rule over what you can and can't do. And then the BBC put it out, and it's absolute brilliance, and their instant reaction to it is, oh shit, we accidentally released something really, really good, we'd better apologize and ruin the careers of everybody.
We released something that actually unseated the nation from its complacency. We actually released something that isn't a fucking soap or reality television or whatever, and that actually it actually attacked their preconceptions of what television was about, of what media is about. And that's the entire synopsis, isn't it? That's the entire thesis of Ghostwatch. That's what it exists for. It's trying to show the audience that, you know what, little Auntie BBC, it lies to your loves.
Yeah,
that's what it is, isn't it? That is
exactly a lot of the things that I was going to say, but you've summed them up beautifully.
But you know what? I think it goes further than that. I fully believe that the reaction to it, which was extreme, and I mean, like you listening to Baumgarten on the commentary, she was saying like she was actually at the BBC at the switchboards whilst it was happening because they had a horrible intimation that someone there would misunderstand what was going on and would cut them off, right? And the switchboards were shutting down. They couldn't handle the volume of calls they were getting. It was insane. It was absolutely insane. And they didn't know. Baumgarten, Volk, all the people behind it did not know it was going to do this. They assumed, Stephen Volk says on the commentary, he says that we just assumed that at one point in the show, people would understand. They'd see all that, that we were using like kind of familiar tropes, we were rearranging them a little bit and pastiching them a little bit. But it's ultimately like a ghost story, it's a reorganized M.R. James style ghost story, but just repackaged in a different medium. And he assumed that people would get that. And they would go, oh, right, okay, so this is what's happening. It's actually a bit of a lark. It's a bit of a joke. Now we're going to sit and watch it as a drama. But that didn't happen.
I went in because, as I say, I watched it at the time, and it never took me in. Like, I'm not boasting about that. In many ways, I'm quite sad about it. I wish it had. I'd rather have had that experience. But I clocked that it wasn't real. And it wasn't just because I saw the thing at the start that said, starring Michael Park, and that it was obviously part of Screen One. It was part of a strand of drama programs. It wasn't just that. It was just, I suppose I was media literate at that point, at that point that I was able to say, yeah, that's acting. That's not an actual person. That's acting. So I clocked it. So I've always been kind of skeptical about this. So, when people talk about, oh no, I believed it was real, and people talk about, oh, the BBC switchboards were jammed, and I've always been, yeah, okay, maybe, I don't know.
Apparently it was true.
But apparently it is. This is my point.
I think
I've been looking into it, and apparently it really is true.
As I was saying, though,
there's estimates about how many calls they got, and it's somewhere like the upper estimates are like 1 million.
Ghostwatch held the record for the most complaints to the BBC right up until Jerry Springer the Opera. Right up until, and it's still number 2. It's still number 2 for the most complaints that they ever received. But I am still skeptical. I'm not skeptical of the reaction, because the reaction was there and the reaction was profound. I'm skeptical of the language people use. So people say, oh, it scared us so much. Oh, it's so disturbing. Bullshit. Absolute bullshit. No, I don't buy it. Maybe you were scared. But that's not what they're responding to. Even if they don't realize that's not what they're responding to. What they're responding to is the fact that it called into question their relationship to the fucking TV.
Yes, and that's something I really wanted to sort of, at least at some point, well, I might as well do it now, because I think we've officially started, haven't we? I wanted to really sort of say, because it really struck me.
I don't get a chance to do intros when we do the show, because you just launch straight into it. So I've given up looking for a moment where I could jump in and do an intro. So just go for it.
So yeah, I watched this on the weekend, first time since the original broadcast. I don't know how much I wasn't taken in, as I've said in the Changeling podcast. My dear old mum blew it quite early on, so I was already I went into a kind of cynical mode. But yes, what really struck me this time on the rewatch was that this says something really, really interesting about the way our media creates landscapes.
Yeah.
Now, and I really want to sort of unpack this a bit, because I think it's very, very important not to be drawn into the sort of obvious explanation, because what this is how it draws people into a consensus.
Yes.
So that for all the steps taken to say this is drama, admittedly, after the BBC got frightened off going for real true verisimilitude and trusting that people might think, oh yeah, it's Halloween, it's a little trick-or-treat thing, because people want to believe. It's the old thing. So instead of us going into the reality of a drama, we get this wonderful conception here where the drama comes into our reality.
Just to very, very briefly jump in with one other observation, is that we're British. People in Britain don't just want to believe. People in Britain want to be annoyed.
Exactly.
Yes, that's also true.
It's the voting with the rage thing.
Yeah.
And this is exactly where I was hoping to go with this bit. And I'm glad we're all on the same page, because as you said, George, using the device and tricks that we associate with quote unquote real life, or at the very least the way real life is framed in these kind of things, studio experts, shaky camera, interviews, vox pops, phone-ins.
Well, they actually researched all of this, They were so intent on getting this right that they went back and they watched things like Children in Need, and they watched Crime Watch, all of the reality television that was on. They even watched like old episodes of Top of the Pops and whatnot to see how the camera worked, to see how the narrative of those shows are framed, documentaries, to get the camera movements right, to get the framing right, to get the patterns of speech correct.
And I think that on the one hand, just picking up from that, we could say Ghostwatch. I think this is the crass theory. You can look at Ghostwatch and go, oh, this demonstrated the credulity of the viewing public, or at least a significant part of it. If we look at these complaints and so on, I think it's so much more subtle than that. This is about how we are positioned by the way in which media creates a sense of authenticity and integrity, and especially when it comes to the supernatural, be it the reaction to The Exorcist when that was released, or the documentary of the Enfield Poltergeist, which this draws on, or Mercury Theatre's War of the Worlds, which we've talked about. Even the most materialist of us, it's in us to have a fascination with the uncanny, the preternatural. That's why we're having these conversations. And as someone who advocates for the materialist conception of history, there's one thing everyone needs to know about it. It's full of ghosts. It's full of hauntings. That's why we're drawn. And this is, as I say, this isn't about the pat answer would be, oh, well, the idiot British public, the idiot common denominator viewers. No, this is more than that. This is really picking up and flagging up how media landscapes are created, and how we're in them all the time, you know, and how they really bleed through in say in terms of general elections or something.
That really
you
is it.
Realize that you are only you. It's not that you can't think for yourself. It's not that you're some wind up Clockwork Orange. It's you are presented with a vocabulary and a series of topics which are the things to talk about. That's the discourse.
Yeah.
And Ghostwatch is totally tapping into that, but using the supernatural, and therefore it's flagging something up. It's flagging up not the unity of people.
It's trying to erode it, isn't it? It's trying to call itself. It's using its own medium to call the. It's actually building a relationship with the audience using an established language, a grammar of filmmaking, and then it's calling that grammar itself and the medium it's operating on into profound question.
Yeah.
And the audience, I think, internally reacted very badly to that. I think the fact that it's on the BBC, that it was the BBC that were doing it as well, because of course it's, you know, this is 1992. It's BBC. There's no internet. There's, you know, most of the news media that we get comes through the television and through newspapers at that point. And the BBC is sort of like enshrined as the grand magister of all of this in media itself.
Retian values.
Trustworthiness and the authoritative statement of what is true and what is real.
Right.
And I think that really is. I think that really is
that it lied to us.
Yeah. But I think that really is kind of the key. I mean, we said this before, that it's not just that the BBC Uncanny or the BBC Gothic or whatever you want to call it, which is a distinct strain and a very important one. It's not just that it has its own very distinct and ineffable quiddity that you don't even get in like ITV productions from the same era that use so many of the same techniques to also touch upon supernatural themes, etc. It's just not the same. It's to do with several things, but it's also to do with the fact that the BBC just has this monolithic, hegemonic, ideological position in British society as kind of the ultimate trustworthy arbiter of what is real. And I think that, you know, what Elliot was saying before, that I think people responded to this and responded to it badly as well. A lot of I think it's slightly overstated, because if you read up a lot of the calls, they got huge number of calls, and a lot of them were rapturously praising the show.
A lot of people were actually very praiseworthy of this show.
People loved it as well. I mean, even the hating it, even the people ringing up to say this is outrageous, how can you do this to me, even they are in a way enjoying it and praising it, aren't they?
Absolutely. And what they're saying unconsciously is it worked.
Yeah, absolutely. And this reaction, this intense gut reaction, it's the fact that this show gets at things that are truer than true, if you know what I mean. It gets at deep truths, because I mean, my opinion is very firmly that the literal truth of the world is that ghosts don't exist, right? But there are much deeper truths than that, truths that are far deeper than can ever be comprehended by people like Dr. Emilio Silvestri, who represents this kind of proto-Dawkinsian, ultra-positivist, rationalist kind of, you know, condescending.
It's amazing how much, like,
science,
tonally, he is like those figures, isn't it? It is amazing.
Absolutely. Now, I might actually, you know, in terms of real ontology, I might be closer to him than I am to Dr. Lynn, whatever her name is, Pascoe. But his political attitude and his social role is anathema to me.
Yes.
And it's because people like him, they might be right about ghosts, but they're wrong about other things. And those other things are deeper truths that people instinctively understand, even if they don't consciously politically understand them. And those things are that media is ideology, realism as it is presented, reality, more profoundly than that, reality as it is presented to us by media is ideology. It is not reality. It is reality as it is constructed and presented to us by powers that are out of our control, the powers that control the means of representation. And the other deep truth is that history is replete with injustice, and the injustice doesn't go away. It just sits there and it piles onto, you know, injustice piled on top of injustice, piled on top of injustice. And these are the things that the Gothic ultimately, sometimes successfully, sometimes well, sometimes radically, sometimes in a reactionary way. But nonetheless, the Gothic is just inherently about these things. It is about the fact that we cannot trust reality as it is presented to us by authorities, and history doesn't go away. It haunts. We are haunted by the past. The past is still here. And this, I mean, it's difficult to think of a media text that communicates those things more brilliantly and more directly of its moment, in a direct and tapped in way to its moment, its cultural and social milieu, than Ghostwatch. So I think the incredible reaction it triggered is people not necessarily really believing in ghosts, but people through that kind of storytelling, these deep awarenesses that people have.
That's it.
I've just been talking about. They're being kicked in that sore spot.
Yes, which they're not often by their media, and they're certainly really not by popular media.
Not even by most, commercially produced uncanny media. Most of that is
of it is ultimately comforting, isn't it? Most of it is ultimately comforting.
Yeah.
The ghost is exorcised, the possessing demon is gotten rid of by acts of faith or whatever.
This is one of 3 that I know of dramatic retellings of the story of the Enfield Poltergeist.
Yes.
There's a television serial called the Enfield Poltergeist, and there's the Conjuring 2.
Right.
And then there's this story has been dramatized 3 times. And the television serial and the movie are both ultimately comforting, heartwarming stories about redemption and family and love and friendship and so on and so forth. This is not that.
This is most certainly not that. No, this is like, again, I mean, what it echoes most sincerely, and again, this is something Stephen Volk is very candid about, is the Stone Tape, which we've spoken about before. Nigel Neal is an obvious influence on this in so many ways. Right, it is the direct spiritual sequel, isn't it? It utilizes the same metaphysics, for God's sake. It is ultimately the same metaphysics, isn't it? Just like in the Stone Tape, it uses the language of like ghosts and whatnot, but what occurs here is not a ghost, is it? Not in the way most people would understand it. It is something else. It is some composite entity or force coalesced from, as you were saying, Jack, from tragedy and trauma, from just this site, that Foxhill Drive, having had so much happen there.
Cruelty and exploitation and predation upon children, very particularly. I mean, you said it's kind of an M.R. James story. It's very much Lost Hearts.
Yeah.
Well, also, I mean, there's even that intimation, very strong intimation at the end, again linking us to Neil and the Stone Tape, that Susan Early will become the next layer of this ghost.
Yeah,
this ghost, which is already a composite personality, and that she will become the next layer, and that juxtaposed with images again of reel to reel, of recorded footage, and so on, really underlines that yet again.
And you know what I always think of when I encounter monsters or ghosts or whatever that have this assimilationist dialectic to them, like the Cybermen and the Borg, and there's loads of examples of this. Monsters,
even the Daleks and their later
the Daleks in a sense, but very definitely the vampires, and the alien in John Carpenter's The Thing. Entities that absorb, accumulate, assimilate, contain, and grow through that process. Predatory organisms, but it's more complex than just sort of eating. Well, I mean, we talked about this before as well. When you eat something, it becomes part of you, and you grow as a result of that. Those sorts of organisms that are based upon that sort of accumulative, and I use the word very deliberately, accumulative and assimilatory. I mean, it just makes me think of Capital, because that is. Right. I mean, this is what Marx is talking about in Capital when he talks about Capital as a vampire. It's not just the exploitation, like the blood drinking. It's also the fact that it grows and expands through that process. And, very, very literally, the growth of capitalism as an economic system in Britain, and this is directly referred to because the show references a Victorian case, the case of Amelia Dyer, the baby farmer. I hope we get back onto that. That's a direct reference to Industrial Revolution era horrors that are all to do with poverty and the concentration of a working class in urban areas, etc., growth in population as a result of capital. It's all about that. That process was a process of capital growing through the accumulation of property that that is based upon basically just absorbing pre-capitalist wealth. That's what's called by the Marxists primitive accumulation. So whenever I encounter these monsters that grow through that process of accumulation and assimilation and absorption, that's just what I think about.
Yeah, and the fact that, of course, Marx himself used the term vampire in reference to things such as dead and living labor and so on. These were metaphors that he was really pulling on, certainly to
the point where Capital has been called a kind of a gothic novel, and I think that's quite
right. Well, even the right that summons the ghost here, or the entity, is itself materialist and ultimately capitalist, isn't it? It's through people glued to their television sets. There's that wonderful line, "Oh, you've created a kind of nationwide seance." Yeah. That is so bloody clever. It's so line. Bloody clever because it on one level, it includes the audience. It includes the viewer. It makes you actually complicit, and it makes you vulnerable. It means that it can reach you. It can do things, whatever this thing is, but it also makes you part of it.
Yes, and I think one of the things that I found particularly kind of unnerving in a way on this watch is that because I'm making the assumption I know Jack and I are, but we are all of a sort of similar age, and one of the things that
I think I'm the oldest.
I'm 38. I'm 36.
Okay, so you're that bit younger. Yeah,
I was 8 when this aired.
Right. Okay.
I was a kiddie. I was very young, but like you, my mother ruined it. My mother kind of ruined it. She recognized the doctor from an episode of Casualty or something.
Case. It was the mum in my mother's case. So Pamela Early, I think that was the. But yeah, I was just simply going to say that watching it as three people and maybe slightly less for you, George, who remember this era of television. One of the things that I thought was really struck me was that it really is kind of how the television of the time was. How awkward it is that there was dead air. There was a kind of TV presenter like Sarah Green, who was on the fulcrum of a kind of 1950s wholesomeness, even though it's the 90s, stage school trained, but mixed with a kind of middle class 80s Nazi funkiness, and it really comes across in actually one of my favorite moments in the earlier part of the production, which is the Kevin Tripp call, because everything about that call is saying, no, this is bollocks. This is the giveaway. This is awful. They've blown it. And yet, as I was thinking that, I thought, oh, hang on, no. I remember those phone-ins on television in the 80s and 90s. I remember the awkwardness when Aswad and Five Star appeared on phone-ins on Saturday morning.
Yes, we're thinking of the same incident, I think.
Yes. BBC got these things terribly wrong. And even in the drama of the period, because I started to giggle, and my other half said to me, what are you giggling at? And I said, in many ways, this is a coming of age for British television. That it's on a fulcrum here. That the 90s was a real shake-up at the BBC, for example. I said, but it is hard to explain that, we're watching something which feels so awkward and stilted. And I think someone younger might very well say, how the fuck was anyone taken in by this? But it's very akin to the TV of the time. But I was saying, I had a thought. I said, it's not just this pseudo drama, it's the actual drama. I can still recall the absolute cringe, toe curling clusterfuck of the very first episode of El Dorado, full of immensely talented people, making that, like Verity Lambert, and watching
1992 as well.
They go astonishing, even as a kid, going, what the hell is going on? This is so terribly awkward. And Ghostwatch is permeated with the same things, but of course, every time you go, that doesn't work, you are, by dint of age, reminded, no, this is on point. This is exactly
it really
television of that era was like.
Yeah. It seems to me that everything in it is calculated. Like every tiny little element in this show is completely calculated. So when it appears to be stilted, or when it's referencing certain cliches or tropes of the era, it's doing it very, very deliberately.
It's a very weird thing, but the weak point in the realism is the professional actors.
Yeah. Oh, you've just basically headed me off at the pass.
Sorry,
that's brilliant, because that is absolute. I mean, I've probably got a vested interest, having been professionally trained as an actor myself, but that's great, because it was the one thing I discussed with my other half. I said, what's really revealing, that the one big tell is dramatic acting, because
yes,
all dramatic acting is heightened, and that's why actors talk about truth or naturalism, not realism. And for every attempt, my heart and soul were with these actors, because every attempt they made to stutter, to think on the line, to reword a line of dialogue, there were just too many tells when it comes to actors. And this isn't helped by little things out of their control, because they needed actors to sell this, but actors don't do the same kind of awkward performances of real people on television that real people do when they're on
and of course it's emphasized here, of course, because you've got the actors acting, and then you've got characters like Craig Charles and Sarah Greene who are just they're just being themselves.
Although Sarah Greene was a trained actor, and I think I've wondered one of the reasons they pulled her in. But I think the real tell for me is, with the best will in the world to them, and it's nothing necessarily to do with their acting, it's another thing, and it's just something I'm just going to touch on very briefly, and it's the kids. They're 2RP. Now when you factor that in with the location they use, which was probably Fox Hill Drive, whether that's a real place or that's the name they've given it, which was probably convenient and fulfilling various parts of the brief. The other giveaway is it's private, which makes an inconsistency when the mum says she wrote to the council to rehouse them, because if there's one thing as sure as damn it, other than the British like being outraged by things, they know class position, and the class position of the family is not anchored down correctly.
Well, this is really interesting. I mean, firstly, I want to agree about the kids. The kids do a great job, but
they do a great job.
Their voices don't go.
They're Sylvia Young.
The voices don't go with the voice, the sort of common person voice that the actress playing their mum is doing, for a start. She does pretty well, but you can tell it's acting.
There is an element that they've just stepped out of the wardrobe from Narnia, isn't there? There is that quality about it.
Yeah, absolutely. The guy playing the scientist in America, I mean, firstly, he's very familiar to me. He was too familiar a face. I'd seen him in loads of other stuff. I think he'd been in sketch comedy and stuff like that. But at the time, my problem, I'm afraid, and I don't mean to pick on her or anything, the actress.
I've lost you.
Lost you for a moment there, Jackman.
Could you repeat your last sentence, Jack?
I was. I just said, she's acting.
Yeah. I think I've got you back.
Hello?
I'm here. George is here.
But we're losing Jack, it seems. Oh no! Oh, is this the start of it? Do you think? Is there
it's
actually
in the machine?
It's in the machine. Yes, it's in the computer. Oh no! Oh my God! Hello? No, I think we've lost him.
Gosh.
Oh, he's the first. Oh dear.
Oh, that's it. He's parking.
Oh my God! This is going to be the last in this series. I swear to God, people listening to this is not a bit. Hello?
Right. I was convinced you guys were having me on. I thought
we actually said is this we swear this is not a bit.
I heard you. I heard every word you were saying, but I thought you were having me on.
No, not at all. if I swear, if stuff starts flashing on my screen, or I'm gone, I'm out.
I'm fucking out of here. Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
exactly.
Okay, so I don't know what happened there, but we seem to be back, and I'm recording.
We are
again,
back,
so,
indeed.
Okay,
excellent.
I don't know how much the recording will have caught of what I was saying. I don't know if it will have recorded you or me, but I was just saying, without any ill will towards her, the actress playing the parapsychologist didn't sell it for me. No. On the night, watching it at 16 years old, she started talking, and I thought, yeah, right, this is acting. Yeah. But the thing I was going to say was to respond to what Elliot was saying about the class thing, because he's absolutely right. It doesn't quite work. It doesn't look like a council house. Yeah. It doesn't look like a council estate. But the interesting thing is that's kind of works for me, because I mean, American ghost stories are hugely about imperialism and settlement, and so they end up being about property claims. I mean, The Changeling is intensely about property claims, as we talked about.
I'm struggling to think of like an American horror story of its kind where there is not a massive house, like just gigantic property
or at least something in it deeply about, who actually owns this land, who has a right to be here. Like all the quintessential ones are, the Amityville Horror is intensely about, stuff like that. Possession is a bit more abstract, but it is fundamentally about ownership of territory, isn't it? It's about intrusion onto, territory that isn't yours. It's
the only ones I could think of are the like really abstract ones, like Don't Look Now and whatnot.
Yeah, but that's a very European piece.
Yes, it is actually. Yes,
that more of a European. Yeah,
and that's the thing, because European ghost stories and British stories in particular are much. I mean, they have longer to evolve, so they're about more things. They're less concentrated on certain things. Like, the American ghost story is just intensely about the settlement of America.
Yes.
European ghost stories and in wider traditions, you get into all sorts of complexities, like the Japanese ghost stories and the Indian ghost stories, etc. But British and European ghost stories are very much about things like class, and they're very much about that process I was talking about before, the process of the birth of capitalism, the rupture with feudalism, the primitive accumulation era, which is why, the Gothic starts up as sort of people in burgeoning modernity being worried about remnants of feudalism, castles and lords and barons and shit like that.
Right.
And then as you get further, it gets intensely concerned with things.
Oh no, not again.
It's like scarring social. Oh no. You haven't lost me again, have you?
No, you've just come back. You've just come back.
Pipes is doing this to you, man.
Yeah. Right.
Well, Pipes is a creature of media, but maybe we'll get onto that. It's intensely about the seismic scarring rupture, all effects of the birth of the modern world and the birth of capitalism, and it's intensely about stuff like class, and the class position of the earlies is really interesting because it's very, very fundamental to this era, this early 90s. The long 80s is just ending.
Right.
We talked about the long 70s the other time. Now it's the long 80s we're talking about. Thatcher's
Absolutely,
gone, and we're in Major's Britain, and Major has all this rhetoric about a classless society, and Labour is moving towards Blairism, where we're all middle class now, etc. There's this pervasive myth in British society at that time, that class is just this thing of the past. That
actually,
nobody
that's a really, really, really good observation, because if this were for somehow, it couldn't have been, because it could only have really come at this a cultural moment with the BBC. But if this had turned up in the 70s, the earlies would have been in a terrace house. It would have been more Kathy Come Home. It would have been like the Enfield poltergeist, where the kids are speaking, that like they're within 3 streets of Bow Bells. But you're absolutely right. That pervasive middle classness, we're all middle class now. It is the classless society. Yeah, that really does characterize so much about the 90s.
And
although
it resonates, doesn't
simultaneously a tell, because I think the subtlety still exists. There was always going to be those people in the audience who go, hang on a moment, how is this divorced woman living? And she wrote to the council, and
that's an interesting question by itself.
Exactly. And you can start to move the goalpost and go, well, okay, maybe she's sort of they sent the kids to a good school, maybe they've got elocution lessons. You can start to rationalize it because of that context of that you've just described.
Yeah, they're that generation that's grown up getting their speaking habits not just from the extended family and extended kinship groups around them, which are kind of quintessential to working class communities pre this era, which had been destroyed by 20 odd years of like Thatcherism as one particularly sharp iteration of the process. But they're also getting their speech patterns from watching Sarah Green and Blue Peter.
It's absolutely true. I mean, I'm kind of an example of that. I'm an example of that. I speak nothing like my parents.
No,
nothing.
And you can almost make the argument.
I grew up in a household with a very odd class position because my father was a policeman. Police is a a policeman has a very complex class position. He's not really of the working class, obviously, but he's not obviously able to live without working for a wage, etc. So it's a complex position. My mother was a shop assistant. My mother's family were more working class. You go back, as I say, my mother was a shop assistant. My grandfather was a milkman. So my mother's family is very working class. My father's family more middle class. But even so, we're talking very lower middle class. So my immediate background is just barely sort of with the fingernails clinging on to the first rung of the middle class, right?
Yeah.
My voice, it's less so now, but when I was younger, my voice was very RP. It was very received English. And I tell you why. It's because of television.
Yes.
Very particularly one program in particular, which Elliot can probably guess which program we're talking about.
No, I completely, I grok this, so to speak. No, this is absolutely so, because he has a very, very similar situation, a family with a strongly working class background, and just a very, very, got rather personal. I like it. Just a very interesting pathway through, because my parents were not only of the working class, but they were, strongly socialist working class as well. My dad was, very heavily involved with his union. They were, and yet, for all their rightful critique of the Thatcher era, they, in a way, were a couple of the lucky ones, who weren't diced and minced by it, because to put it very, very simply, the 80s, we were cash poor and we were working class on a council estate, and then through a series of mishaps, really, my father was made redundant. He was sort of forced to become a business starter. He had to get on his bike, as the loathsome Tebbit would have said. But he was forced, and then he had an unexpected success. So the 90s, we were suddenly catapulted into something very different, where we were no longer cash poor by quite some extent. It was as if our lives had been folded in the middle. Everything changed as we went into that decade. Suddenly, the prospect of higher education was, the grant system was just about in existence, was now something I was able to access. I became the first person in my family to go to university, and things like that.
Likewise.
But also, as you say, the context of the time, you really do probably get this sense more so across those two generations of the working class than any other, because of the whiplash effect of the 80s going into the 90s, where the kids don't sound like their parents. They're much more educated than their parents formally, so in a strange sort of way, having
it kind of works,
looked at it as being
it kind of works.
Superficial tell, I was like, actually, now we've dug into this a bit, I can buy it more.
But it's more than that as well. This is the working class experience of Thatcherism to a huge extent. It is complex. It is ambiguous. For millions of people, it was. For millions of people in the working class and the lower middle classes, which is, in Marxist terms, it's pretty much the same thing. In Marxist terms, if you have to sell your labor power to make a wage and you can't live off investments or property, you're in the working class.
You're in the working class.
So, for millions of people like that, the long-term social effects of it have been beyond catastrophic. And we're really, it sounds weird to say, but we're only just starting to see it, to be honest with you. The horrors that we know already are just the starters on the main course hasn't even arrived yet. But in the immediate term, in the relatively short term, right up to like 1992 and even past it, for a lot of people, there were still a lot of people that it had worked for to some extent. It had taken away in many respects.
I was very careful about how I said that, because of course, my position on this. But you're absolutely right.
Well, I'm the same, steadfastly anti-Thatcher. Anybody who knows anything about me is not going to think I'm any sympathy with Thatcherism.
I'm a miner's grandchild. You can imagine what the rhetoric of my house was like.
from the son of a policeman. My apologies. But this is why it works.
My grandfather was beaten up quite a lot. Yeah.
Well, I know. Not to go into any greater details, but I actually, I know some things about this from the other side. But this is why it worked. This is why it did work in the short term, because it did offer things to people. It wasn't just all sort of Thatcherism boot on the throat constantly. This is what's insidious about it. It gave with one hand while it took with the several other hands it had because it was a sort of octopus, but lots of people did. My own mother, I say she was a shop assistant. She also later developed career opportunities that, a girl from a council estate whose destiny when she was a teenager was to be a hairdresser, she could never have dreamt of. She did find career opportunities that, of course, down the line, I was very lucky that she did, et cetera, et cetera. This is part of why, and it divided people against each other based on this sort of success for some and, trodden into the dirt for others, and also success in some ways while taking things away. Because it's like with, some members of the working class are being kicked further down so that other members of the working class can be elevated. That's part of the divide and conquer. The other part of the divide and conquer is that it will give you things like the opportunity to buy your own home, which, as somebody pointed out recently very cleverly, I can't remember who it was, but somebody on Twitter pointed this out very cleverly. The best way to look at that is to look upon it as a form of rent control. It's like controlled rent. If you've got a mortgage, you've got essentially kind of control over how much you're going to be paying for your living accommodation. Whereas if you're renting, you're always subject to what the bastard landlord wants to do to you. And of course you deregulate councils at the same time, so that the same time you're starving them of money, you deregulate them so that they can charge people more, etc., etc. It's very, very calculatedly insidious.
It's so bizarre to think, isn't it, that all of that seems to be encapsulated here. If you look at the way Fox Hill Drive is positioned, and also you get that. I noticed this time round, I only caught it sort of like subconsciously. I didn't articulate it to myself in the way you just have, Jack, but there's a segment in it where Craig Charles, it cuts to the outside of Fox Hill Drive, and Craig Charles goes around interviewing people on like some waste ground and whatnot. And it does have this quality of like, we are staring, we the bourgeois with our televisions are sat staring at this council estate and the things that happen there as though it's it's something apart from society. It's something that in 1992 in post-Thatcherite Britain shouldn't be, because we are all now middle class. In fact, there's almost an element of like, maybe you deserve this because you're poor.
But because there's a sort of smoke and mirrors thing going on, you're also very conscious because of the imagery that you are not on a council estate. You are on a cul-de-sac of rather nice semi-detached buildings, which are clearly. So it's a really interesting smoke and mirrors thing.
There's a lot going on.
Another really interesting thing, another really key detail for me, and I don't know if this is just sort of a detail of the house that they chose to film it in, because it looks very real. It looks like they just chose a house and filmed it.
I think,
or whether they did this deliberately, whether they deliberately brought these props in, but. Pamela Early's house is full of hairdressing equipment. She is obviously a hairdresser, right? Now, that suggests to me that she's a freelance hairdresser. She's got the equipment in her own bedroom, right? So her class position becomes even more ambiguous. Is she somebody who works for somebody else? Is she somebody who's employed by a hairdressing shop in town and, has stuff at home to do like moonlighting on the side, for her? Or is she like a freelance private hairdresser who goes around and does people's hair, as her own business? She has an ambiguous class position. There's no doubt that she is meant to be, of the working class, but she is very specifically, even if in an ambiguous way, a part of that semi-rising section of the working class that kind of sort of did okay out of Thatcherism, but is left in this very precarious situation where she's never quite got up to the point where she can own her own home, and you have the broken family thing,
right
and that's very important, because I want to know why those two got divorced. I want to know.
And where is the father? What is there is something there, isn't there? It's almost like the absence of the father in this nuclear family has allowed this, or undamned it somehow.
Given that there are strong implications right the way through about abuse of children, including intimations of sexual abuse of children.
I think outright statement at one point, isn't there? The phone call about Tunstall towards the end. Outright states that Tunstall was a child abuser.
He's a child abductor and a child molester.
Well, it's probably one of the more, actually controversial points in the thing, that it does end on the voice of a girl saying, "He's hurting me." And I think that, this goes into some seriously dark places. I was actually, because I couldn't quite remember how it worked, I just had these impressions of it. I didn't remember the backstory at all. And I did say to my other half, I said, "My God, this backstory is fucking dark. I mean,
Yeah, right.
But in a way, I think almost the most lurid bit of it, because I sort of sat there going, right, I really sort of expected them to just sort of go with a kind of BBC, well, we'll just stick to the uncanny, the supernatural,
More M.R. James,
but you know, more M.R. James, yeah. But we've got sort of intimations of things like the Moors murders territory. We've got the paedophilia. As I said, there is the sound of a child being abused by a ghost on television.
There's that description you get from when Craig Charles is interviewing that woman in the park, where she talks about how a dog was found that had been slaughtered and it was pregnant. And there were fetuses scattered everywhere. It's like,
one
what
of the
the
many
fucking hell?
One of the many intonations. I actually I looked some stuff up as a result of this, because I was thinking, what was on the mind of the writer? What was in people's minds when they wrote this? What would have been in the minds of the people watching it? And I was a little surprised upon some quick Googling, to find that both the Bulger case and Jill Dando's murder happened after this.
Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. Yes, 93, weren't they?
Bulger was 93. Dando was actually 1999, believe it or not.
What?
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, gosh, I have really pressed that back into the earlier part of the decade.
Really kind of expected them to be contemporaneous with this, particularly with the sort of television, the riff on Crime Watch, and the very decided twist at the end where it starts becoming overtly about a killer paedophile.
Right.
And unfortunately, the other thing they've layered in is the sort of sinister cross-dresser element as well, which is, unfortunate.
That is a real shame.
It is unfortunate. I mean, in a way, it almost gets away with it, because it's not about the character being that. What it's almost intimating is, again, it's this layers of evil thing, isn't it? It's the fact that it's the figure of Tunstall wearing the dress of an old woman is actually the composite of the two entities.
Yeah, it can just
in literal terms, it's nothing to do with transphobia at all. It's about possession. But when that leads in textual terms to lines like, he said there was a woman inside his body, you've got problems.
You do. And I do think that's entirely unconscious. I really do. I don't think that's but at the same time, you're right. It conjures, especially with a present day view, and given what's going on in the UK now, it really does conjure something rather dark, doesn't it?
It highlights very deep-rooted, long-standing worries and anxieties and suspicions about people who are not gender conforming. Particularly the link with paedophilia. I mean, it really. I don't want to. I love this piece and I think it's brilliant, but I don't want to undersell this at all. That bit is terrible from our modern point of view. Because this is a huge social problem in our society now, particularly in Britain. Transphobia.
It's huge. It's
I think we all agree upon how widespread and how disgusting it is, and so you shouldn't downplay this. Having said that, having sort of cleared my throat on that, there's no excuses for it. I think it's, what I was saying was, it does speak to very, very entrenched attitudes of suspicion towards people who are gender non-conforming, to the point where just summoning up the idea of sort of a meshing of a man and a woman that results in a man. And mental illness as well, certainly. But again, the meshing of these things, mental illness, murder, paedophilia, gender queerness in some sense, the meshing of a very threatening concept of sort of the man in the dress. Basically, I mean, not to be crude about it, but that's it. The idea of bloke in a dress, as Eddie Izzard put it, is so threatening to people that it just instantly gets drawn into these same associations.
It becomes a kind of shorthand, doesn't it? For everything that's sinister or everything that's...
One of the things that you were just addressing, and I was thinking about, anxieties that were about at the time, wasn't the and because I said, there's parts of this that seem to be heading into Moore's murder territory, just as there was that point, and I can't remember the exact year, so I might be a little bit off, rather like you shocked me about the Jill Dando thing, is that there was that issue around the point of I'm sure it was the 90s, when there was the big furore over the Turner Prize with the artist who had used the composite of Myra Hindley's face, and there's a sense that these things were in the air. That was a big news story that was very, very controversial about. I think it was made up of children's paintings, children's
handprints.
That's right.
This is why I really did expect. Firstly, I expected the Jill Dando murder to be roughly contemporaneous, because I thought that's why suddenly Crime Crime Watch has become like a threatening locus.
Mm-hmm.
But the other thing was that I thought that the Bulger murder must be just before this, because the thing about the murder of James Bulger is
the
that
BBC would have run it.
Well, no, this is it. They probably wouldn't, would they? Because not even Channel 4 finally aired the Brass Eye episode that was about paedophilia. But this is the thing, because British society was like, for a while there after Bulger, British society was like touch paper on this issue, because it really triggered this intense cultural paranoia hysteria about children and child abuse and paedophiles.
Well, this is 1992, right? So historically, it's only just coming off the back of the likes of the Video Nasty Scare, Massive Moral Panic, Mary Whitehouse, I believe was still around at that time, although she was a little bit quieter.
But no, I mean, in the years following the Bulger murder, we had like riots with people attacking people on, in neighborhoods that they had decided were pedophiles, and the famous incident of, pediatricians getting bricks through their windows. And so it was like that. And the News of the World publishing like photographs and lists of names of, perverts and stuff like that, telling people basically where to go if you wanted to beat up a pervert.
Which was largely code for go and beat up queer people, of course, by and large.
Of course, because it always is.
Because it always is, isn't it?
Yeah.
And actually, maybe this is perhaps above everything else the biggest tell we have on Ghostwatch is we know the BBC is so craven it would have pulled transmission as soon as anything went wrong. In fact, they've never gone for anything like this, and it would have gone for anything like this in the first place. And it shows, I mean, because as we said right at the top, they have buried this, the most successful
completely disowned it.
Yeah, the most successful single drama in terms of ratings of that decade and beyond, and they have not only expunged it from the record, no repeats, nothing,
no VHS, nothing like that.
No reward for those producers and directors who brought them the single biggest rating success they had of that decade. But Richard Broke, who was the executive producer on it, tells the story of him being taken aside in a corridor and being told that you will not campaign, because basically when you hit a certain amount of ratings and a certain audience appreciation, you are allowed to campaign to BAFTA. Because that's how it works. Everyone sort of thinks that it's all terribly fair, and everyone just, someone just goes, oh, that's the best thing that happened. No, you campaign. It's just like the Oscars, it's like the Golden Globes, everything. And he was taken to one side and said, you will not campaign BAFTA. And then the last straw in it, and kind of and I think Jack will know exactly what I mean, because he knows something of the back history of Doctor Who as well. One of the most craven people ever to work for the BBC, Jonathan Powell, basically washing his hands of Richard Broke in front of him and saying, it's over, mate, because I don't want to hear the word Ghostwatch ever again.
And never did they. I mean, it was only in the early 2000s, I believe, the mid 2000s, that the BFI DVD came out.
Yeah, and now Broke was already somewhat into his career, and he repeatedly given the BBC massive successes, regardless of my subjective opinion on them. But the other big drama he did was a thing called Tumbledown, which was a huge success.
I remember that.
But Baumgarten was considered something of a firebrand. That she was going places, and this stopped it.
Right.
This success stopped her in her tracks.
That's amazing. I mean, it's very clear when you hear her talk on the DVD that she is so incredibly considered as a director. She knows of which she does and of which she speaks. That much is incredibly clear.
Yeah.
You imagine how bitter that must be to have your career on track and it's stopped by the fact that you make something that's just too good.
That's too good. Yeah. I mean, my God, it says something about British society, really, doesn't it? About British culture, that we don't want to be moved. We don't want things to be questioned at all.
But it's that
what we want is fucking
BBC.
We want EastEnders. We want Coronation Street. We want stuff that comforts us all the fucking time. But I
don't know how much it is us. I think it's the maternal or paternal, really, because attitude of institutions like the BBC at the time, because Jonathan Powell at the BBC and the entire group of people who were in the know about Ghostwatch happening, when this was first intimated, they were like, oh yeah, this could be really something. This could be such a winner in the war with ITV. This could be, and then as it came closer to transmission, we're getting a little bit uneasy. We're getting a little bit more uneasy. But I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll just put screen 1 at the top, and we'll put Stephen Volk's name. But you carry on, and then when the House of Cards come down and the switchboard is jammed, they just all the people who actually did it, they just cut them loose and just say, right, okay, you're not any longer part of this corporation, and it's that.
I've got my alibi.
Yeah, exactly. And it's so insane.
It's incredible, isn't it? It's incredible. And the fact that it made the BBC get incredible cold feet about doing anything even half as daring or interesting for like decades after.
I think it was the way it was the way the internal culture of the BBC was moving anyway, and this really I think is like a rupture moment that epitomizes the general trend, isn't it?
Although it has gone down in history, hasn't it? People remember Ghostwatch, and not only that, creators now actually pay homage to it. So there was an episode of Inside Number 9, you know, the show that Steve Pemberton and Reece Shearsmith did, where they homaged directly Ghostwatch. They did a Halloween episode which homaged it directly.
Well, we had, I mean, you know, it's not necessarily the greatest legacy it had, but it made a multi-millionaire of Yvette Fielding with Most Haunted.
Right,
you know, because you know they were deliberately pulling on that. They must have
definitely
thought, wow, that's our open door now.
Well, this is
and another Blue Peter presenter as well. You know,
that's actually officially his name now, Derek fucking Akora. He didn't want it to be, but the pressure from the public was so great that they had to legally change his name to Derek fucking Akora.
Betty loves Dick.
I love the fact they used to give him anagrams, which were basically saying you're a fraud or whatever.
Yeah, it was Creed Kafer, wasn't it? Someone on the team who hated his guts, basically, planted the fake story around one of the locations of a character called Creed Kafer, which is an anagram of Derek Faker.
Yes.
See if he'd pick it up, to see if he'd actually go with it. And lo and behold, in the episode, he actually, you know, when he does his I'm possessed kind of thing, but I'm still going to talk like in my accent and with my idioms and whatnot. And he gets possessed by this Creed Kafer, and it's like, you absolute fraud, you absolute conscious fucking fraud, you know. Unbelievable. But the irony of that is that Ghostwatch should have paid to that kind of television, because it destroys it. It actually, by its very nature, it tells you that don't trust things that call themselves documentaries. Don't trust the television when it's telling you something is true, because it may not be.
In fact, one of the things that Baumgarten, which I thought was so fascinating, was one of her inspirations for even getting this going. And when she encountered Stephen Volk's scripts, which of course were originally for a six-parter,
a six-part drama,
was that she was. It's almost you know, Baudrian, because she was watching the first Gulf War being transmitted. I mean, really the first for the majority of British people, the first real televised war. And watching it and go and just sitting there going, how much of this is micromanaged? Because of course she was in the BBC, she was aware of how things were done, and she was like, I'm being led up so many paths here, so that I make a decision and an agreement, and I throw in with this, or I criticize the bits that I'm allowed to criticize, and there is a vocabulary I'm being presented with, and that is the vocabulary I will have to speak about it in. And then when she discovered Volk's work, and she was like, I know how I can bring those two things together. She's a smart woman. She's an
astute woman. I mean, she talks about on the commentary how that exact experience, and she talks about how during this era it was the first time that news reports were allowed to use dramatic music, for example.
One of the tragedies of the BBC is that, like the Labour Party, it exists as kind of this hoover that sucks up passionate, intelligent, thoughtful, committed people and subjects them to corporate discipline, and makes them think like the establishment, so that all the ambition and thoughtfulness is kind of sucked out of them. And I think that that's a process that you can see kind of at work. I'm not talking about specific people, but One of the things about the BBC is that, you know, the BBC News programs and BBC News website are still widely considered, you know, the most trustworthy, the most real, the most truthful.
I mean,
if you go to BBC News, you just get wall-to-wall ideology, and I think that's part of. I think part of what Baumgarten is sensing, certainly in the way the BBC is buying completely into the media managed spectacle of the first Gulf War.
It comes back to something I sort of felt at the top of the podcast, which is I remember having a conversation about this with someone recently who I was actually, in a certain sympathy with, but I was just trying to redraw the lines a little bit, because I think again we end up in this on the wrong argument. It's a bit like saying, oh, how credulous the British public is, they bought Ghostwatch. It's the same problem, where the problem with the
audience you produce to it.
Well, yes, exactly. And the problem with the BBC is yes, I totally agree with you about the ideological aspect of it, but you've got a situation at the BBC where firstly they're underpinned by a philosophy for their news that is simply malformed. The balanced and objective, it doesn't work. It's been proven time and time again it does not work. But secondly, the other problem is a lot of this is kind of almost accidental, because everyone who is working in broadcast news at the BBC have been drawn from the same places.
Yes.
Oxbridge. They've been they've got the same class position, they've got the same experiences, they've had the same training. So the point I was trying to make to this person whose critique was kind of right about certain ways that news is presented to us, and sometimes the rather obvious bias, but it's like those people, when they tell you that they're not biased, they really believe it because they're drawn from the same. I think some of them have, the insight they know, but it's the classic Chomsky thing with Ma, isn't it? If you thought differently, you wouldn't be sat here interviewing me.
Yeah,
it's that basic. They've all been drawn from the same place. It is a closed shop.
Yeah, same political loyalties, of course.
Essentially, it's encapsulated in the idea of realism stroke reality as ideology, and that is precisely, although in a way that's encoded and removed to a certain extent from like direct news reportage, it's exactly that ideology of what constitutes reality stroke realism that is being directly critiqued in Ghostwatch.
Absolutely, yeah.
And then it's symbolized in probably in some ways the most frightening part of Ghostwatch. And I mean this on two levels. Firstly, I actually kind of got a chill. And secondly, because of the points it's trying to make, or certainly the points we're interpreting it's making, is the moment when that Vox Pop interview suddenly slows and pauses.
Yeah.
And you're just left with a frozen image, and the sound goes down.
Yeah.
I got a proper chill out of that, but I thought this is one of the prestige moments in the piece. This is it. It's the fear of dead air.
Well, I must admit, like one of the things that really strikes me every time I watch this, and it gets me every single time, is how sophisticated. I mean, this is something that occurs in horror media consistently, particularly visual media. You get the scares, you get the set piece scares, and they occur here, but they are very well framed and they're very, very sophisticated. You've got that moment where the frame pauses and the sound distorts. The one that gets me every single time comes very early on. And it's where you've got Dr. Pascal and Parky in the studio, and they're chattering away about one thing or another. And somebody says, hang on, we've got a phone call about that piece of footage that we played earlier from the girl's bedroom. And someone says, I saw a figure in the corner of the room in the darkness, and they show you the footage, and there is a figure there. And putting yourself back in 1992, where you're watching this for the first time, you can't rewind it, you can't pause it or anything. There's definitely like the vague outline of a figure there, but Pascal and Parky say, I can't really see anything, and I've examined that footage a lot. And then later, what the bastards, what they do is they make you doubt your own senses. They rewind it and play it again, only now they take the figure out. So you sit there going, well, did I see it?
Yeah.
And I think that the addition to that is, although certain people in 1992 would have been watching that on a Dolby ready television set, I know for one thing we were still watching on like a 625 line screen, which would have made it even harder to get the verisimilitude of that and to realize if you were being played or not.
Well, they even try to pass it. So Pascal says, its face is in the fire. What's happened is there's a dressing gown or something that's been hung up, and you're seeing a human figure. It's not. You
can never recreate that experience. It's live television in 1992. There's no pause. There's no rewind. That you're probably not recording it, so it's gone. It's there and it's gone. And as you know, watching my lovely BFI DVD release on my laptop screen, I've got much clearer resolution than anybody watching a normal television that they hired from Rumbelows, would have had in 1992.
Exactly.
So
Absolutely true.
The other thing is that people say, well, you see it once, and then they say somebody saw something, and they play it again, and it's there, and they play it again, and it's not there. It's actually, I watched it this time, and I watched very carefully to see when it was there and when it wasn't. And it actually appears and reappears twice. The first time they show it, it's there. Then when they replay it, it's not. And then when they replay it again, it is. And then it's not a replay. There's a cutaway, and then there's a cut back to it when they're doing the thing with the light pen on the screen, and it's gone, and then it's there again. So it seems, if just on the surface, it seems a bit like cheating. It seems a bit like they're as you say, they're being cheeky bastards and they're playing around with you. But as we get further and further into the show, it becomes, certain things become apparent. Certain things about Pipes become apparent, which is that Pipes, he exists through people's perceptions of him to a great extent.
He's a consensual ghost.
He is a perceptual ghost as well as a consensual ghost. He is inherently perceptual. He is inherently of the media, and this is where it ties into the really quite savage satirical critique of the media that is contained in this. Not just the absolute savagery of Craig Charles and so on, doing this heightened version of himself where he's being a total annoying dickhead, and the savage parody of that kind of BBC family friendly. We secretly think our audience idiots, hijinks sort of thing. It's not just that. There's a profound savage satire of the ideology, as I say, the official ideology of realism and reality as mediated through the BBC, the controllers of the means of media reproduction. And it's doing it via the fact that its ghost is fundamentally a creature of media, because Pipes gets his power from the fact that he is perceived, that he is looked at. You get this thing that the youngest kid is the one who senses it. She says several times, they want to see him. At one point, she points at the camera and she says, "Look, they all want to see him." And he's getting his power from the fact that people want to see him. And he's not just being communicated through the media. He is actually in the media. He is of the media. He is a phenomena fundamentally. He is in the signal, the video signal. So
he's
when
been conjured, isn't he?
And reappears and disappears and reappears again, that's him choosing or being able to show himself in the signal based on the level of perception, which is based directly on the level of concentration that's coming from the people looking at him.
It's quite brilliant because it actually ties in. Using that, it actually ties into the Gothic rhythm of the rhythm of the Gothic story, where you do get this escalation of phenomena, which is even commented upon. It's commented upon by the parapsychologist. It's quite amazing. By the way, guys, how many times did you see him?
One of the things that relates to this is that about how many times see him is that. Firstly, I just wanted to pick up on the point of the choice of the name, because I think it's polysemic. Pipes is not only in reference to the radiators and the bang of the radiators. It is how things are piped into our televisions, are piped into our homes.
Yeah,
so that links with Jack's point.
I'd also venture to suggest a slightly Freudian reading as well to do with.
Yes.
The reproductive organs, to be honest, especially if we buy into the whole thing about sexual abuse going on. But sorry, go on.
But the other thing was, and this relates directly to your point, George, about how many times the image that made me smile was when they're on the reel-to-reel and you see an almost Pazuzu-like image of Pipes behind Dr. Pascoe, almost conjured out of light and studio and the sort of fine mist. Yeah, and I was like, well. This is really interesting because it is actually drawing on our collective, quite modern ideas. It's a program that's caught in controversy, that's pulling so much on a film that courted controversy. I mean, we're not, the cats in the ceiling evoke the rats in the attic in The Exorcist, the stopped clocks, the stopped watches, the scarred young woman who is spoken through, Pazuzu-like images of Pipes that appear in the background. The ones I spotted were definitely the one behind when Dr. Pascoe on the reel-to-reel. There is he's there on the gantry when the light explodes at the end, and he is reflected in the glass of the French doors. He's behind the glory hole door.
You see a very quick glimpse of him when the glory hole door is open, but just before the cameraman falls over.
Yes, but the one I didn't get, and I'm afraid I did cheat, because one of the things that I Googled was, I thought, how many times does he appear? I know their aim was 13 for obvious reasons, but there's one time where he is right behind the British rail spiritualist.
Yeah, he's right in front of the camera.
He is like right there,
right in front of the camera, and you don't see it. It's brilliantly framed. It's so brilliant.
Yeah. Plus, also, I think, it's not just Exorcist, but the one that made me laugh, and my partner and I chuckled at the same time when they brought in Thermocam. I was like, are we a year after Silence of the Lambs here? We are basically redoing the final scene of Silence of the Lambs with Agent Starling, with Sarah Green wandering around. And even when he reached out his hand, I was like, oh my God, is that his hand? Or evoking Buffalo Bill? Is that the hand of pipes? And I thought, they're actually, although they're drawing on this much older thing for very, very good reasons, because they are kind of cousins under the skin, they're right up to their date with that little bit of Thermocam, which really amused me. I thought, so someone on board really thought this one through.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a lovely bit of sort of visual escalation as well, isn't it? You're taking it to very strange territories.
Perhaps you guys can answer a question for me, because in some ways, Pipes' most effective appearance for me is an appearance where I've never actually been able to see him. And it's the bit in the bathroom where Sarah Green sees him, and she jumps out of it. And I have to say, Sarah Green, for my money, gives the best performance in this.
Yeah, she's great.
There's a couple of bum notes, but on the whole, I think she's bloody brilliant.
Yeah. But she's really good.
She sells that scene in the bathroom where she's in there doing something. She's getting a glass of water or something for the kid.
She sees it behind the door, doesn't she?
She sees him behind the door. And I've never been able to see him in that scene. And I've often thought, is he in the bathroom mirror or something and I'm missing him?
I can't see him there.
No.
I think only she sees him.
I think only she sees it, which for me, that's weird, because because that made me jump out of my skin when I rewatched it for this. It's apparently it's solely based on
He is there in the
performance.
scene directly after. When they go back into the bedroom and they're ushering the kids out, the camera pans across very briefly. He's not there. Then it pans across again, and he's just like for a split second.
And it does a double take.
He's there.
That's almost too much.
They just start to push it at that point. But I do love how
framing. I love horror that does that frames its monsters or its ghosts in this very sort of is it there, is it not there way. Yeah. A lot of sort of like a lot of the more recent descendants of Ghostwatch do it. Yeah. I mean, like the Slender Man films, the ones that are on YouTube at the moment, things like Marble Hornets do exactly that. That is how the Slender Man is framed.
And then, Blair Witch Project takes it to a whole nother level of abstraction, because it just...
We're ahead of Blair Witch here, of course.
Yeah.
Blair Witch is activity and all those things.
Rumoured to be directly inspired by this, although I think the people that made it say they hadn't seen it. But this really is a huge progenitor of the whole found footage movement that comes afterwards. Although it's fascinating, the similarities and the differences, actually. That's an interesting subject. But Blair Witch, you don't see anything. And then in the remake from a few years ago, you do see the witch at one point, and you see it very fleetingly. You see something, a figure, but you see it and it ruins it. It
ruins it completely.
I mean, not that there's much to puncture by that point, but
no, I mean that even if it were a very good film, that would have ruined it for me, and it's not. It's just it's one of those found footage films that misses the point of found footage so profoundly.
Yeah, I really rate Blair Witch. It's one of those movies that its stature grows for me with the years. Past the height.
It terrifies me every time I watch it, and I've seen it so many times. There's just something about it. I don't know what it is. It's an X factor. There is this. It's that creeping dread. It's that inevitability. The fact that they're fucked.
Yeah, well, it's that bit where Heather just repeats to herself, "It's not the same log," and that just that's like fingernails down my soul.
It's the cruelty of it as well. Whatever it is that's acting on them, because you don't know what it is. You have no idea. It could be any number of things. There's no definition of what this power, this force, this whatever is. It's so cruel.
Yeah. And that's really, it's cruelty that is sort of concatenated into whatever it is in the house in Ghostwatch.
Right.
Because
it's the same kind of phenomena, isn't it?
It is very much so, because you have two origin stories. Again, I love the ambiguity. You know, the ghost could be either, and I think it's strongly implied that it's kind of both, that what we're dealing with here is some sort of force that is like all these different things layered on top of each other.
Yeah, it's both and neither, isn't it?
Yeah, it's both, and it's not exactly that it's one again, it's a bit like The Shining. You know, whatever it is in the Overlook Hotel, the hotel is a kind of corporate entity that absorbs and grows. It's that monster of absorption, that capital monster I was talking about before.
Elemental negativity.
The ghost story is so inherently about life under modernity. It's such a modern genre. It's a quintessentially modern genre because, you know, we've been telling ghost stories since forever, but we've only been telling capital G, capital S ghost stories since the birth of capitalism, you know.
Right.
And they are fundamentally about stories about the fact that capitalism subjects human life to rule by sort of inhuman abstractions and stuff like that, and spectral forces that we don't have control over, and, you know, like property and value and profit, etc. And
economy.
Exactly. And, you know, this thing keeps coming up. This is my favorite type of Gothic. This Gothic that is about the concatenation of historical injustice into these areas or these places or these people or these syndromes or whatever that are just sick with history. Where history is
that's a great phrase. Sick with history. I like that.
That's what it is in The Shining, and I think in all these, it's in the Stone Tape, it's in the Changeling to an extent, and it's definitely it's in the Blair Witch. It's fundamental
to ghost stories, isn't it? Surely it's fundamental to them.
Absolutely, but I think there are some stories that get at it much more profoundly than other stories, like and I think the stories that we're choosing to talk about in this series, we've kind of instinctively gone for these stories, which are
there is definitely a thread, isn't there?
There's definitely a thread, and particularly with the question of media, you know. But that, again, we were talking about how this story expresses the idea of, you know, media itself as an expression of private power, you know, that's out of people's controls, that spreads this ideology that we call realism, but isn't really anything to do with reality as we really experience it.
Yeah.
So, and the other thing is this kind of sickness of history, which is injustice piled upon injustice and cruelty piled upon cruelty. And the two things in Ghostwatch are the child abuser and murderer Tunstall, who, as far as I can tell, isn't directly based on anybody in particular, although, as you say, the spectre of the Moors murders is, of course, there. And the Mother Seddon, she's called, which is the Victorian, the Industrial Revolution, primitive accumulation era baby farmer. And baby farming was like, people literally couldn't afford to take care of their own kids. They couldn't look after their own kids and work, because the wife had to go out to work as well, or the family would all starve. So they would hand the baby over to these women, usually elderly women, widows, single women, etc., who would look after their kids for a fee. And there's an infamous case, which I think Mother Seddon is directly based upon, which is Amelia Dyer, who was a baby farmer who murdered, and we simply do not know how many children this woman murdered, but it could be 400.
Wow.
Apparently. Because she used to take the money and then strangle them and then take more. She was known as the Ogress of Reading or something.
Wow.
But my partner made a point as we finished it, which actually chilled me almost more than the thing. And it's not something I really necessarily want to dwell upon, but she was sort of driving at the point of, you know, this is a piece by the BBC, which is, you know, it is partly manipulating its audience, but partly reneging on that, because you know, the BBC is always fundamentally craven about these kinds of things. But she said, when the backstory starts to come through, which you're touching on there, and she said, you know, given that this is a BBC production and it's about BBC manipulation, it's a damn hard watch in the era after we now know about Jimmy Savile.
Right.
God,
and
I
never thought of that. I just went, oh Christ! And
there is an entirely other resonance now, isn't there?
Yeah, with pipes and everything. She said, yeah. She said, I don't really want to have a conversation about it. I said, no, I don't blame you. She said, but you know what I mean. She said, you know, in a way, that if we were watching this in 1992, it would be with a certain innocence about aspects of the BBC,
the culture of light entertainment, which, as we now know, was sort of this you know, gaily coloured patch over a festering sore of abuse.
Exactly. I mean, he is an extreme case, but how it ruptured, and so much, I mean, obviously through things like the Me Too movement, but, you know, but in other respects, how much has poured out of and you know, the BBC doesn't necessarily work differently to a number of big institutions. It takes care of its own. It buries things. It conceals things. There is, and and it was I had a proper sort of yeah.
Wow.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that, Vicky.
Yeah,
I
kind of
had
the same impulse that leads the
wow.
bigwigs in the aftermath of Ghostwatch being controversial to sort of, you know, ruin the careers of everybody involved and stop talking about this, etc. It's the same.
I mean, I slightly
covering
recoiled
institutional
from the Kilroy moment, but wow.
It's interesting as well from the BBC's perspective how they've had. They've never had much luck with this kind of thing, because one of the things that did also occur to me was, well, I say they didn't have luck. I mean, this was hugely successful on one hand, but that they were obviously extremely sensitive about it. But I was somewhat reminded of one of the things I did during the lockdown was rewatched the old BBC 70s series Secret Army, and Secret Army ends with a pulled episode. The original episode 14 of the third series, which is not available anywhere. I had to really dig for it. I found it online. It's never been given it's never even been put on as an extra on the DVD release. Is set something like 25 years after the events of the final episode, with the expulsion of the Nazis from Belgium, and it does it as a television broadcast. It does it as a live documentary broadcast with all the characters, suitably aged,
wow,
or unsuitably aged, and it's a complete.
I was going to say, I bet that's a sight to see. It's
a complete disaster. It is like another bunch of people from a different production have got hold of all the actors and the set and everything, and cobbled this thing together. It doesn't even feel as if it's anything. Even the very characters are completely misunderstood that they're playing completely different versions of themselves. Wow. It's appallingly acted, considering how well these actors did in the bulk of the series. I mean, some of the better
hearts
actors
weren't in it, were they?
Well, no, and it's just appalling. And they pulled it, but it's basically exactly the same format, sans the supernatural element, as Ghostwatch. It runs in exactly the same way. There's a paternalistic presenter. There are experts about the Second World War and the Belgian resistance. There is someone on the ground who goes in. It unfolds exactly like Ghostwatch.
Fascinating. That is really interesting.
Complete disaster. But again, something else the BBC buried. But they buried it rather more successfully. It was the run up to transmission, and the head of series and serials at the time, I think it was probably someone like Graham MacDonald or something, went, we just can't show this.
Just can't air it.
It's not good enough. It's below broadcast standard.
Wow.
And bearing in mind some of the things that went out in the late 70s.
I was going to say, wow, how bad was it?
Buried. And when the DVD releases were made and everything, I found out about it. It's almost like this kind of rumor that floats. There's the 14th episode of Secret Army. What are you talking about, the 14th episode of Secret Army? It exists. Dig away, find it. And I found a ropey copy of it online. And it's fucking awful. But it's... But it's fascinating how these two things that basically are complete parallel to one another. And they've both been buried by the BBC.
Yeah, fascinating.
They can never do this, but it's taps into everything that we said. This is television, of course, very much about television, explicitly so, and yet.
I remember last week you made a very interesting point about how the stone tape is kind of like the production of television. It's about the production of television. Yeah. Very much so. This is one of the many ways in which it's a direct sequel.
But it's almost like the look into the mirror is the problem, because they always fuck it up. Now, either by
even worse, they don't.
Yeah, by making either bad television like that 14th episode of season 3 of Secret Army, or making actually very good television, the fallout from which they can't handle. I mean, in fact, fallout is probably, it's just struck me on the thing, because the only thing I can think of in the span of that era of television, which probably had a similar effect on the audience, was Fallout, the last episode of The Prisoner, which similarly jammed switchboards and again, you know, this history repeating it. Patrick McGoohan got on a plane and fled. Craig Charles got on a plane and fled to Corfu after Ghostwatch because he said Smithy, Sarah Green, and Michael Parkinson did absolutely the wrong thing. They stayed to answer questions on things like Bite Back, got pulled over the coals. I went to Corfu and had a holiday for 3 months.
That was probably the astute move, to be perfectly
totally
honest.
the astute move. He said, I knew what the writing was on the wall. I got out.
Although, you know, apparently Parky was well up for it.
Oh, yeah, because he says he sort of knew what.
Yeah.
I mean, this could be down to his experience as well. I mean, he'd been in the broadcast media for so long, he had probably had a good chance of second guessing it. But what's interesting, I do find funny, is Baumgarten saying, I managed to find a really hideous Laura Ashley dress at the back of my wardrobe, which I proceeded to wear to every single interview to look like the kind of Middle England concerned woman who might be in the National Viewers and Listeners Association, just so I could get through the various bite backs, open airs, and points of view unscathed, a little less scathed than I was, because I just tried to look like them. I thought, this is another reason why this woman's so smart, you know?
So weird. And I love the characterization of like the National Watches Association like being another species almost. I need to dress like them. I need to put myself into the mindset of these like professional complainers. Yeah, I love it. But
it's perfect, isn't it?
There is an interview with Parky on this. They actually produced like an anniversary DVD for Ghostwatch, which is just interviews and documentaries. And there's
BBC, I presume.
Yeah. There's an interview.
BBC did it.
No, it's the BFI, I think.
Oh, I was going to say, yeah.
They're still like, no, don't ever talk about it ever again. Don't mention it. But Parky is on it, and he actually says, yeah, absolutely. I know exactly what was going to happen. I read it through, and I know exactly what was going to happen. It's why I wanted to do it.
I love that.
Yeah.
Not even Wells did that with War of the Worlds.
Right,
although he kind of with the famous press conference after the War of the Worlds where he sits there being all baby-faced and apologetic. He's also kind of almost winking at the camera and going, "Yeah, I knew, and I don't care."
But it's interesting how Ghostwatch sets them up as a mirror of a family. I mean, Parky is the patrician. Green and Smith are married, and I love how they play on the sort of torturing of him within that universe, because they were famously married as well. And then Charles as the sort of adolescent kid who's sort of riding roughshod in a sort of punkish attitude of it. It's you know, and then
it's a bit like how the young ones are secretly a nuclear family.
Yes, yeah, very much so. And of course, I mean, with Craig Charles, when it blows it apart at the end, when it takes his voice away, effectively, you can't hear anything that's being said, and he's just like running around as the police and the ambulance are there.
Yet more proof of my contention that Craig Charles is, or at least was, a really, really good actor, because he's parodying that kind of cheeky chappy persona, and that, you know,
he's perfectly cast.
BBC presenter shtick mercilessly, but he's doing it just straight enough that you can think it's real. And then in those sections when he thinks he's off camera and he's helping get people out of the house, he's totally convincing.
Yeah.
In fact, I do remember, and this is a 30-year-old memory, so it might be a bit dodgy, but I do remember that prior to, as I've said repeatedly, Mum blowing it, before she finally recognized the actress playing Pamela Early, when he jumps out of the cupboard with the mask on, I do have a memory of my mum going, "Oh, really?" With everything they're going through. And I remember my mum being properly annoyed when he sort of burst out of a cupboard with the mask on and frightened Sarah Green. Yeah, that really.
But again, I have to give props to Sarah Green, because that bit would be so easy to fuck up, because she's supposed to be, you know, she's supposed to be really annoyed about it, but hiding it for the camera and pretending to be, you know, like what's there is the character bit is, "Oh, that fucking idiot, I'm going to have a word with the director later," or something like that. But for the meantime, because I'm on camera, I'm going to smile and go along with the joke. And that's such a delicate thing to ask somebody to do. And she does it really, really well.
I have to say,
stuff.
Sarah Green being, quote unquote, frightened in that moment, getting to one of the things that I guess we're ostensibly here, but which is, everything that we've watched is on some level designed to unnerve or frighten us. I have to say, the moment that did frighten me was, ironically, the moment that gives it away, and it is the moment with Suzanne banging on the pipes.
Yes.
Frightening because of there she is crouched, the sort of and the implications of the psychological state of this girl. If it is, nothing of the supernatural involved, and it is. I thought that young actress's performance in that moment, crouched, manic, banging on the pipes, proper, and the camera just panning around and finding her, really did give me a moment. It's like,
she does very well in general. Yeah, especially funnily enough in the moments of extremis, she's very good. And I love how closely it tracks the actual events of the Enfield haunting. As I say, it's even down to the, essentially the exposure of the fact that it was a fraud.
That it was ultimately a massive fraud.
The pillow shot, the pillow photograph is lifted very much directly from one of the
famous photographs of the kid's bedroom. David's soul has become James Donovan, but it's the same thing. Yeah,
they absolutely recreate those photographs, don't they?
Yeah.
But one of the things that struck me watching this is, like, if this was actually real, if there was a family to whom this was actually happening, or at least who thought this was actually happening to them, right? Like, no fakery, no fraud, but there's no ghost maybe, but they genuinely believe they're being subject to this horrific ordeal. The attitude of the TV show and the presenters generally would be inexcusable.
Well, this is the interesting thing, because
there's a bit where Parky actually kind of bullies a child.
Yeah,
there is. Yeah,
in a way, Ghostwatch is speaking of the sensationalism that the reactionaries were saying was coming into television. It's this wonderful two-way mirror, because if this. If there had been some, we'll properly explore this, there might be something. It would have been done in such a different documentary style. The fact that it has gone for this almost proto Jerry Springer with elements of Crime Watch, that in a sense, as I said earlier, is the biggest tell about it. The BBC would not have done it this way.
Yeah,
no. But it's also almost a snubbing of the finger at the very people who are saying, well, it's all this terrible sensationalism, and although the term dumbing down didn't come along until later, it basically carries the same meaning. This is where we're going, and there's a cigarette paper now between the BBC and the Light Channel, which was also often being said around that time. With all these sort of worrywarts from the home counties, viewers and listeners, it's just, you can't tell the difference between them now. The BBC should stand for Reithian values, and and in a way, it's a wonderful satire of those people. I don't mean this flippantly. I mean it in almost in an old-fashioned sense of the word. But actually, a great deal of Ghostwatch is a very, very good comedy.
Well, it's funny you should mention that. I haven't gotten a laugh out of it before, but this viewing, I got a couple. I did get a couple. There's a point in it where Parky is kind of haranguing the parapsychologist, and he's saying something like, first it was Susanna, then it was Kim, then it was Susanna again. What's going on, Doctor? And she goes, and she's silent. She's looking at the screen and goes, you don't know, do you? It's like, just so blunt.
Come on, Professor. This is all bollocks, isn't it?
Right.
Again, just as you want to go, oh, that's the tell. You remember all those times that Parky was like that in the context of his own show.
Yes,
the way he would patronize these sort of like young actresses and things, or not so young actresses, very established actresses in some case, on his chat show. And you're thinking, well, it's a tell. Oh no, actually, because we have like another 16 examples of him being actually like
Parky
this.
Being
this
Parky,
is
isn't it?
Parky. He's absolutely riffing on himself.
the big tell is as is often the case with these things, is the time compression. Like the big tell with the War of the Worlds, the Mercury Theatre broadcast, is how quickly everything happens, and if you concentrate on it, it's comical. You get from welcome to BBC One's Ghostwatch, we're going to have lots of fun watching a haunted house on Halloween, to the entire country has been taken over by a vengeful ghost as a result of a mass televisual seance within 87 minutes, you know, with multiple revelations and plot twists, etc. in the meantime. So it's all, this is one of the interesting thing about this, looked at as a found footage movie, is that it solves several of the problems of the found footage movie. The most obvious and perennial and kind of cliched being, you know, why are they still filming?
Why are they filming?
Well, they're still filming because that's just what television does. It's
it's TV.
Keep going. It's a big mouth.
There for.
It's a big mouth sucking stuff in.
Sarah Green says it. It's what we're paid for. That's what she has that line. She actually has that line in the show.
Yeah. But the one thing it can't do is cut away. Like, you know, when you've got a scene in the Blair Witch Project, you can have a cut, and that cut can stand for, you know, 6 hours has gone by, and they've moved further into the forest, or, you know, they've woken up after a night in the tent or whatever. This can't do that.
No,
so
in fact, the only time
concertina time
deal with it.
Yeah, the only time you have cuts in this show is when Pipes is communicating.
Yes.
It's when or the Force or whatever it is stringing together images and sounds and throwing them at you to sort of say something.
But I think even beyond that, there are a couple of points in this where they know that they've got to operate within a 90-minute time slot, but they do a couple of rather neat things. Number one is Parky repeatedly says, we will be coming back to this throughout the night. Now, if you looked at your Radio Times that night, you would have seen that, oh my God, actually, no, this is 90 minutes, and then we've got Match of the Day on afterwards. Or whatever. But there's this insistence that they're going to come back to this. And I think they do a fairly good job of, and it's a tricky one to pull off because they could have simply lost audience. They make the first half hour, 35 minutes incredibly boring.
Yes.
Yeah.
And stilted. And so they handle it, I think, as best they can, given the limitations there. But I think, again, it's that wonderful thing where the BBC we kind of know what they were doing, but they must have known in those big department meetings when the production team would have to go in and say at what stage they were at and how it was going to be done. So people channel hop. Not everyone buys the Radio Times. These things don't, and the things like Screen One by Stephen Volk don't necessarily ensure that it's going to be classified that way in the minds of the casual viewer, because television is not watched like cinema. People are making cups of tea, they're talking and arguing and shouting over, and it's just there.
Yeah, and we all understand aesthetically a lot more than we understand literally.
Yeah.
Which is how television works. It's the language of television.
I can never get over the, as I say, the sort of two-facedness of that floor of the BBC going, oh well, no, we weren't on board with this after all. We don't, and we're going to make you all scapegoats. I mean, compared to some of the injustices in the world, but because we're focusing on this, it feels like a proper injustice that those people were just thrown under a bus.
And it is so typical of the, you know, the cliched saying is, you know, success has many parents, failure is an orphan. It's so typical of the BBC that success is an orphan in this case because it was the wrong kind of success.
The wrong kind of success. That's
in a way,
isn't it?
Again, it sort of links into something that you know we've been long-term viewers of, but the classic response to Doctor Who by the BBC in the last century. You know, this program that cost them nothing to make and brought them enormous revenue through their through merchandising. The fact that of all the things that the BBC have made, 40-year-old programs are released on DVD and get massive sales where they can even be the #1 selling DVD despite what Hollywood has offered that week. And to actually sit down with someone from the 6th floor of the BBC in the 1970s, 1980s, or into the 90s, they'd be, we don't get it. We don't get what. what's going on. And it's that same lack of understanding comes.
And it's not just the BBC either. I mean, it happens. I mean, it's endemic in the BBC. Don't get me wrong, it still is.
Well, there's a snobbery in there as well.
Absolutely,
because they don't want to be ITV, and yet this program is saying, "Aha, we're making you basically an ITV program."
Right. It happens all the time, doesn't it? I mean, an example from my childhood is the show Nightmare. Does anyone remember Nightmare?
Oh God, yeah.
I
used to love it at the
Nightmare.
start when it took place in a computer generated environment, but when it was just sort of taking place in an actual environment with color manipulation or whatever it was, I went off it because it wasn't interesting. Weirdly, it wasn't interesting to me anymore once it became too literal.
Well, that lasted for 8 seasons, right? No child's program in the UK lasts for 8 seasons, and it was pulling in at its height the kind of viewers that Top of the Pops was pulling in at the time. It was huge. It was an enormous success, and it was cancelled at the height of its success completely arbitrarily, because the someone who took over at ITV didn't understand it, didn't like it. That was it. That was it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Elliot and I could go into a huge Doctor Who digression at this point, but this isn't the place for that.
I think that must be a conversation.
Like to hold your sanity in check as well, as much as we can.
I mean, my experience of Doctor Who is more the resurrected Who. It's like since the Russell T Davies, obviously, but I will happily chat about it.
I venture to suggest that the whole thing is a bit of a prospect, but I think there are bits and pieces from the classic run, 63 to 89, that you would find interesting. I think there are things here and there that I think you would like, George.
Excellent.
I think maybe I should put together a playlist for you.
Yes, please do. That would be superb. I'd love to.
Wow.
And in a strange way, rather like Ghostlight. Thinking of Doctor Who. Ghostwatch. Ghostlight is an episode of Doctor Who. Ghostwatch. Doctor Who and Ghostwatch had this sort of odd last laugh, really, with the BBC, because this program famously sort of either they were nonplussed about it. That was at best. They were nonplussed about it, or they absolutely loathed it and wanted it off. And now it's their flagship program, and now it's it's the program that is being, that they're doing a deal with Sony over. I mean, it's insane.
It's mad, isn't it?
It is really. It's like, who's written this bit of popular culture's history?
Ghostwatch, of course, has gone down in history. People remember it. They absolutely remember it, and it's still fondly held now.
Yeah.
I said to a friend of mine, Charlotte, I said, I'm going to catch up with this old friend of mine, one of my oldest friends, and going to catch up on the weekend, and literally not seen her the whole time of the pandemic, because now we're all double jabbed and we're sort of coming out of our bubbles a bit more, and and I told her I was doing this. And she's around my age, and she was like, "Oh my god!" And it just the excitement. She said, "I want to listen to this podcast." She said, "In fact, I'm coming to see you on Saturday. Are you okay to watch it again?" I was like, "Yeah, fine," because she hadn't seen it since. But it's still there. It's one of those big deals,
That's the reaction
for our
you get
generation.
From everyone who was around at the time. That's the reaction you get. Oh my god, yes, I remember that. They don't necessarily remember it was called Ghostwatch, but when you start explaining what it is, you say pipes to them, and they're like, "Oh my goodness, yes."
What was particularly unsettling was this friend of mine, Charlotte. She sent me a photograph just a little bit earlier than I met her. I met her when I was 19, and she sent me a photograph of her at 14, and she looks like Suzanne Early. She's got the hair and things. She said, and she sent it, went, "Don't I look like the eldest daughter?" And I was like, "Jeez, too soon. I've just watched it."
Yeah.
she's the spit as a girl.
Brilliant.
Well, what do we think? I mean, to conclude, what do we think of the gag at the end where Parky gets possessed?
Well, I think by that point, everyone's there, and I think they can almost get away with it going into fun. I mean, as soon as one of those big old cameras starts moving past him of his own volition, I was cackling.
Yeah, I mean, people would have got it,
now.
wouldn't they? If they'd have
And in a way,
if they'd have stayed and watched, they'd have got it. At that point, they'd have realised it's a gag, it's fun, they'd have gone with it.
It's Halloween, it's trick or treat.
They didn't. They turned off.
And I think that's the thing that Stephen Volk and all the people involved went, oh, people would just go, this is trick or treat, right? It's Halloween.
Yeah.
And through various reasons, and I think in a way they were both very sophisticated about the medium they were working in, but they missed a vital thing about it. And it comes, and if I do say so myself, it comes back to something I said right at the very top of this, which is how media creates landscapes, and they didn't factor that in. It's not that people are push button, that they're stupid, that they just believe everything they see. It's much more complex than that. But there's also this desire of people wanting to believe, and it comes down to that same thing. Most of the time we're asked to come into a world. This was one of those wonderful times where the world blasted into us. Their world.
I think there's a degree of underestimation of the degree to which people do thirst for the numinous.
Yes,
the transcendent.
Absolutely.
I think
totally.
That is
Fox Mulder's right.
I mean, in that at least, there is
this is little else, but we want to believe, even those of us who are, materialist, and
totally.
We buy into the scientific method.
I will freely admit, if I could find something like Fox Hill Drive, if I could actually experience that, I'd be ecstatic.
Oh, I'd be there. I tell you, I think this is why I'm such a Lovecraft fan, because Lovecraft, for all his disgusting attitudes and his revolting politics and all that I completely disavow and reject and condemn, all of that stuff, there is something in Lovecraft that echoes deeply with me, which is that he is a materialist. He's a pretty hardline materialist, as I am myself. He's a vulgar materialist, whereas I'm a dialectical materialist. But he is nonetheless a materialist, and yet he is absolutely thirsting and hungering for that transcendence, that numinous experience.
And if we wanted to be, I don't know, it comes back to something you were saying earlier, Jack, about the locus of ghost stories in the changeover to capitalism. If we wanted to be kind of high-minded about this, its perfect antecedent really is Hamlet. It's all in Hamlet.
It's all in Hamlet.
Confronting young Hamlet, Catholic. The Catholic country, and the boy who's been educated in Protestant Wittenberg, but the desire for the ghost, the desire that young Hamlet has. I mean, and that's why sometimes I know, bloody hell, Hamlet. Everyone always talks about Hamlet. That is, because I'm being a Shakespeare geek. It's that classic thing where you don't like the Beatles, you like the Velvet Underground. I don't like Hamlet. I like All's Well That Ends Well, but I actually do like Hamlet. I do like Hamlet, but that is the vital part of Hamlet. That whole thing about things, shifting from one phase into another, and then how ghosts emerge. Literal.
Hamlet's father comes from purgatory. To the new world that has left ideas like that behind. It's literally the pre-Reformation confronting the post-Reformation, and the split down the middle is the rupture in history, the crack in history.
The best kind of haunting, because it's about history.
That really is that, as you say, it begins there, because that really is the birth of, it's the early modern period. It's the birth of the modern ghost story. It's still not what we recognize as a ghost story. It's not M.R. James, although the wonderful thing about M.R. James is that he kind of doesn't really write ghost stories, but that's a conversation for another time.
That is a conversand for another time, but you're absolutely right.
Ghost stories are enduring. It's really very similar to the same reason that Shakespeare is enduring, and with Shakespeare, of course, we cannot take away the fact that how he put words together and how he put stories together. But man, the times he was writing, that's the vital thing. It is fulcrum. It is a hinge moment, as you say. It is, and ghost stories, they're enduring. Our enduring fascination with them is because it keeps reconfronting us with that. We can't escape it.
Yeah, those fundamental ruptures and crevasses that are in the face of supposedly rational modernity that we all in this world, we face the constant possibility of just suddenly tumbling into one of them without any warning, and that resonates with people deeply, as I think the extremely well calibrated and profound satire of the BBC ideological authoritarian version of what is or isn't real. I think that resonated with people enormously, to the point that it did so. These things in combination, they resonated with people beyond the ability of the people creating the texts to foresee how much they would resonate.
I think so. It aroused something very deep, didn't it? Probably inarticulate in many cases as well, where people didn't necessarily understand what they were experiencing.
People, not to sound patronizing, but people very often don't really understand, in the sense of being fully able to analyze and articulate their own responses to text.
Absolutely true.
They know they feel something deeply about it, and you'll often get people who say, "Well, I didn't like this, that, and the other because it was too silly, or it was too long, or something." And it's like a what's the word? It's like a synecdoche for something else. They're using a part of the text to stand in for something holistic or dialectical about the text that affected them in a way that they haven't quite got to grips with.
I think the real tragedy for Ghostwatch, in a way, is that it is the ending of something. More fundamentally, I think it's because certainly in a quite superficial way, but television has really cleaned up. British television, BBC television, is really cleaned up after Ghostwatch. In fact, one of the things that just to make one very last crossover with classic Who, is one of the things that has consistently been said to me by people who watch the new series and know that I was around for the old one. When they see bits of the old one, they go, "It's a lot more brutal, isn't it? It's a lot more bloody." It's a lot. Yeah. It's like because drama is under so many controls now about what we can show, and a great deal of it seems to stem from the furore around Ghostwatch, the BBC's own internal furore, really, which was, oh my god. And when we were talking about the stone tape, and it's not just in terms of necessarily imagery or implication, but again, there's this whole slew of stuff that used to be talked about and explored on television and in television drama that simply isn't anymore. The bandwidth has shrunk so much.
Culture is so policed and sanitized, and this is you hear this, but you hear it from the wrong people talking about the wrong things. You will, you don't have to go very far now to hear, truckloads of people who will tell you that you can't say anything nowadays, you can't do this now, you can't say that now without getting in trouble, etc., etc. And when people talk like that, they are almost always talking about the wrong. They're just talking bollocks, frankly.
Yeah, they're talking nonsense.
Yeah, they're saying, basically it boils down to, I'm not allowed to be openly racist and sexist anymore without being criticized. That's almost always what it boils down to.
Yeah.
Whereas it is nonetheless true that society has in some ways become more sanitized and more policed and more puritanical about things you can and can't say. And it's actually not it's actually not the things that the people who rant on about cancel culture and so on will tell you.
Completely different things.
It's actually the other way round. I mean, I was talking earlier about how depressing it is that people think of BBC News as kind of like the gold standard of truth and impartiality, whereas it's all ideology. You try finding any outright, sustained, serious, sensible criticism of Israel's policy in the occupied territories on BBC News, you will not find it. And even when they are forced to present and to report the most outrageous actions by the state of Israel in the occupied territories, they will find ways to ideologically manage the reporting so that if you're not paying very close attention, you will walk away thinking it was a case of Israel defending itself at the
one of the real acute ways in which that is done and has been consistently done. And I can remember when I had this kind of the doors opened and the windows blew in moment with that particular the way in which that particular situation is reported. And this was years ago, but it was a moment where I went, oh my god. And it was just simple understanding of formal structure of how to write an essay or article, because I've been brought up in the education system. When I was reading an article, this was pretty much before a lot of my political ideas were formed, but being able to read about a situation there, I go, hang on a moment, and then cross-referencing it with another article, cross-referencing another article, and all the injured or dead Israeli victims of a situation, they're in the first paragraph and they're talked about in the active voice.
Yeah, it really
the
is that crude
Palestinian
sometimes.
Injured and dead are in the fourth paragraph talked about in the passive voice. And I think, do they even know they're doing this?
Yes.
Well, this is the thing. This is the thing. First, I want to say, firstly, when I talk specifically about BBC treatment of Israel-Palestine, again, it's a synecdoche. It stands for a whole range of things. It's not just Israel-Palestine. It's a whole load of things that just aren't reported about. And this is the thing. It's because they stray outside what I think John Pilger once called the circle of thinkable thought, or the circle of the thinking, within the realms of what sort of official the BBC official mainstream centrist conception of reality considers to be real.
That's what I meant by media landscape earlier.
Realism as ideology. It is not the sort of evil elites at the BBC are sitting around a table rubbing their hands, sniggering and saying, we shall censor this report about Israel. It's not that. It's that they, again, like Chomsky talking to Ma, if you thought differently, you wouldn't be there. It's hired. The people that end up doing these things are the people who are in touch with that same conception of reality, who accede to those ideological propositions as reality. And so the idea of framing the report in any other way seems to them to violate what they take to be the real world, the parameters of reality. And this is, to bring it back round a bit, and it might seem like a sort of a banal or pathetic example after talking about the occupied territories, but Ghostwatch is jabbing at precisely this, because it is saying that reality is, for so many of us living in the information age, subject to constant messaging by the private or corporate, or in the BBC's case, sort of weird position of the BBC in terms of power structures. But it's definitely some kind of authoritarian structure that's outside of our control, private in that sense. The people who have these monopolies on the means of constructing reality, on the means of representation and communication, day to day, our conception of what is real is constructed by things like media tropes, media landscapes.
And I don't think this is a banal comment, because the thing that we must remember with Ghostwatch, of course, is that one of the biggest architects of this thing was simply a perceptive, clever woman who watched the unfolding of the first Gulf War on a television and went, hang on a moment, and then brought that to bear. Brought that to bear on a piece of writing that Stephen Volk had produced, and go, right, okay, I know how we can marry this.
Yeah, it's intrinsic in the text. It really is.
So Pipes becomes the intersection of historical injustice and the construction of reality through media by powers that are outside of our control. Pipes literally is that. It's not just that he gets into it or infects it. He's compatible with it because it's just what he is. It's just what he's made of.
Yeah, and for all the other suggestions that the name brings, I do think pipes into your living room is key. Is key. What we have control over. He has control of the signal, but it's because we have control over your signal. It's the old outer limits thing. We are interrupting
control
transmission.
The horizontal.
We control the vertical. Exactly. And the fact that it backfired on them is just beautiful.
Well, it got too close, didn't it?
Yeah,
it accidentally told too much truth.
Yeah.
So there's a radicalism that's embedded in it, which of course will appeal to me.
Yeah, right. I mean, but what does strike me about beyond its resonance, which is incredibly profound and is obviously something that I think we've come to later on, certainly, wasn't barely commented upon at the time, barring certain very key commentators like Kim Newman, for example, who understood it. What struck me about it is how well it works on a technical level. I mean, I don't know about you guys. When I came back to it, I was terrified that it was going to be boring, or it was going to, without context, it was going to it just wasn't going to work.
I do think it helps. I suspect it helps that I'm from the era. It more so in a way than the stone tape, where you can learn the vocabulary if that's something that you. I think this is in some ways the language of Ghostwatch is so subtle that it says something I said earlier. Everything that you think is a goof, you have a memory of actually happening in all the television around the time.
Yep.
But I think maybe for an audience that's younger than us again, without sounding patronizing, I hope, but it might just be too much of a barrier because because I think you had to be inured in all that kind of television and have a memory of it, because there were definitely, I was having that kind of 2021 meets 1992 conflict at times where I was going, oh come on, this isn't working at all. Oh no, hang on a moment, but I remember that happening and that's exactly like this, even down even the way I remember the excruciating way when the Blue Peter Garden was vandalized and the way that was reported, and that mixture of patrician-like sermonizing coupled with trying to still be kind of down with the kids, plus moments of dead air, plus moments when the presenters ran out of things to say because they didn't know how to bridge the bits in the auto cue, and it's all there in Ghostwatch as well. And so it's like, but unless you were there, I think it might be tricky. I don't know how much this will work for an audience, say, of 25 years and younger.
It's interesting because I think maybe to get the full effect of it, you probably kind of have to have a brain like ours, which is at least partly formed by growing up in this particular media environment. So,
and also, I mean,
you have to have, to a degree, a conception of reality that is partly formed by this kind of media construction.
Yes.
Post 9/11, which is terrifyingly and disorientatingly if you think about it, which was only 9 years after this.
Oh wow, God,
it's a whole different thing, isn't it? The whole idea of sort of like the live broadcast that broadcasts unbelievable horror, complete with glitches and dead air and people not knowing. It's kind of, people who grew up in that world, they're going to have a different response to it.
Yeah, of course they are. I never thought of that, but of course they are. But my God, I mean, being people who grew up with the development of this media, of this technology as well, I imagine helps. Being able to remember, albeit briefly, a time before there were, for example, home computers and video game consoles and even Sky television or whatever. That kind of helps.
But I think probably what is thin on the ground and where it does still have a certain power is that there are certain touchstones of television where it goes beyond being merely good. In fact, good almost doesn't come into it. It's more somehow in a way monumental. I mean, there's this, in its way, the stone tape, Abigail's party, home, the final episode of The Prisoner. These things, these kind of moments where you could discombobulate or inspire or drive an audience a little bit, crazy in some way. When do they happen now? They don't happen now. Television, the nature of television has changed. It is not the same thing anymore.
We seem to be haunted by the attempts at them, don't we?
Attempts at them,
because these sorts of episodes that you're talking about are moments. I mean, television is always a social force. It is always a moment. It is always a force in constructing social reality day to day. But you get these, like the episodes you're talking about, like spike points or I'm trying to think of the phrase. Doesn't matter.
It's almost like the water cooler conversation stuff, isn't it? Like Twin Peaks, for example.
But sticky out bits in the process.
But it's when the water cooler breaks. It's so big. Everyone's feet gets wet.
But it's these are like moments where the process suddenly becomes incredibly visible because some sort of rupture takes place and suddenly the television episode you're watching seems to sort of reach directly out of the screen and grab you. And so you see the process, whereas normally it just trundles along quietly in the background.
Even the good stuff.
And I think we're kind of haunted by people who grew up in roughly the same era we did, trying desperately, chasing desperately after something of the same and trying to do. I mean, that episode of Inside Number 9 you mentioned, and Charlie Brooker's Black Mirror, I think, for example, there are particular episodes of that which are like that generation, our generation, I suppose, roughly speaking, trying to recapture that moment where television really seemed to jump out at you and at the society as a whole.
But the change in popular culture is so fascinating through its mechanisms and everything, because in a way it's parallel to sort of how you can never have an all-encompassing pop star again. I mean,
the monoculture's gone.
Yeah, that monoculture's gone. Whether it was
it's when you refer back to Michael Jackson or someone like
Jackson.
that, right?
That's that.
There isn't an equivalent phenomena, is there? You can't actually. It's very difficult to explain to, say, younger people now, like what Michael Jackson was in the 1980s and early 1990s. Because there isn't an equivalent phenomena. I mean, someone who was literally everywhere, could not turn on the television, could not turn on the radio without him, couldn't turn on a video games console without him being there in some way, shape, or form.
This is where you realise that the event horizons of the media that because we are between mid-30s and mid-40s, have experienced the rapid event horizons, and sometimes it's not really even that noticeable until you confront something like Ghostwatch again. You go, my God, this is not only is this of a time, it's of a time that can't be reached, and yet we're still massively haunted by it, pun unintended, and so on and so forth. But you suddenly realize how in some ways the history your history moves very fast. And you're suddenly on another plateau altogether, and it's like, Jesus,
it's basically archaeological.
David Byrne, how did I get here?
It is basically an act of archaeology at this point.
But it's interesting to ponder how our reactions have changed. For instance, the reaction to Ghostwatch, for all that it was in many respects hysterical and unreasonable, it was also in some respects it was a serious moral reaction on the part of people, and it was. There's a part of me that wants very much to kind of sneer and laugh at the kind of person who will pick up the telephone and ring the BBC to complain, but it is nonetheless a serious reaction. It is something, if you do that, there is something that's got into you and twisted your guts and made you have that impulse. Whereas now it's, and that might be the one of the only times, or one or two times in your life that you react that way to something. Whereas now huge swathes of the population are on social media. We're just reacting to things constantly, and there's instead of just one cultural event every few months that makes some sort of dent, there's 100 every week, and they move by. You get the last episode of Game of Thrones, and then 5 minutes later everybody's talking about something else, and it's something new all the time, and it has its 1, 2, 3 day cycle on Twitter or whatever, and then it's gone, and it's instantly replaced by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 new media events, all of them manufactured, all of them calibrated to be media events, all of them inviting and demanding this immense reaction, but the reaction is kind of perfunctory and shallow and instant.
And this is why I would love to for our generation in a way to be to know, because also probably less so you, George, but certainly Jack and I would be what would be considered techno immigrants rather than techno natives, because computers came along in a way that we know them now when we were a bit older. But not just computers, but the way the media has changed and social media, that if someone, and I'm being crude about this, I am being a vulgar materialist about this now because I just don't have, but if someone could just literally have the maps of the contours of our brain from 1992 to now, I bet it's so much more fascinating in one area than probably any previous generation, with the exception of perhaps the generation who went through industrialization at such a rapid, it's all been reshaped.
It is a fascinating thing, isn't it? So I've spoken to our mutual friend Kit Power about this many times, about how we are, in many respects, we are a media focused generation. We have, our entire lives are dominated by it. Everything we know, everything we are has been informed by it, and we have grown up as technology and media itself has evolved and grown up. And it's a very strange place to be. It's something that I think we wrestle with a lot in our own lives and in the media that we ourselves create.
And it's very difficult sometimes to wrap one's head around it, because it was only recently that another mutual friend, Christine Kelly, put up on Twitter that it was Bob Dylan was 80. And I thought Bob Dylan is as old as popular music, effectively. I mean, there's a little bit before him with Little Richard and Chuck Berry, and then the blues singers before them. But popular music, as we know it, he is that generation. Unless they died through drugs overdoses or various accidents or whatever, they're octogenarians now. They are, and it's whoa, that's
right.
And we came along in the middle of that as well. We didn't come along at the beginning of that, and it's just that kind of telescoping of time is you get confronted with it every so often, and it is like Jesus,
yeah. And it often does refer to media, certainly. For me personally, I find, I'm a huge fan of cartoons. I love cartoons of any description. And I was on YouTube the other day just watching clips of Adventure Time, and there were people in the comments saying, "Oh, I grew up with this." And
that's such an interesting phrase, isn't it?
My reaction to that was, that's impossible, because Adventure Time is new and you can't have grown up with it. Yeah. It's not. And they did.
Yeah.
Well, guys, I feel like we're winding up.
Yes.
Thank you.
It's been a fantastic discussion. I think it's our longest one yet. We didn't even get to talk about why it's called the glory hole. I was sure that was going to be a huge topic.
It is past the watershed, but I still don't think we should necessarily.
What is going on there? Because as I said before we came on, I'm fairly certain that the term glory hole was in popular usage. I wouldn't know, because I am gay, but I was 8 years old at the time, so I wouldn't know.
Yeah.
But I'm sure I was a little bit older, and I was very very fascinated by the world around me. So it was definitely.
I imagine it was. So
it is a weird note, isn't it? I wonder if it's because the text is not straight. I mean, we might have made it sound like we think this, but I certainly myself don't see the text as sort of straightforwardly, politically right on or anything. Certainly it has that distressing note of transphobia, phobia of people who are gender non-conforming, etc. And I think, I don't know. I mean, as I said before, I want to know what the divorce was about, and then there's intonations of child sexual abuse all the way. I don't want to sound like that guy on YouTube who thinks every horror movie can be sort of solved by saying, "Oh, the kids are being abused. There you go, I've solved the movie." But I mean, there are definite intonations of that throughout the film, and I don't know. Like the husband has a dark room in there, and the kids are traumatized by the divorce, and they blame the mother for him going, but at the same time, there's this horrible thing going on, and he's not there. And then I wonder if maybe there's some sort of intimation of something a bit homophobic in the intonation that the father might be a child abuser, and also maybe I don't know. I don't like where it goes, but it does kind of point that way a little.
If in a sense you run along the idea that Pipes becomes a projection of their own repressed memories, which is But I think one of the glorious things about this, as we said about the stone tape, is again, this is television from an era that doesn't hammer out every. It leaves imponderables floating. It trusts us to go away and try and unravel things for ourselves.
Although I could actually just go and message Stephen and ask him.
But then, of course, you're relying on a 30-plus year memory, and
that's true.
We re-edit our memories, and particularly writers. I've met a few.
And it's not even, my guess would be he probably just called it that because he thought it was funny.
It was unconscious. It was just one of those things. It was a term that turned up in his head while he was writing, and it was just like,
he was already prodding at the parameters of how television. He probably, it's very easy. I just threw that as in one extra little bit of bad boy writing, I wonder if I can get this one under the radar.
Yes, it may have been nothing more than that. Can I actually get this under their noses?
It's a bit like thinking of Craig Charles. It's a bit like the very famous meant to be soft expletive in Red Dwarf, which is actually far more transgressive than it's meant to be there as a stand-in for a swear word, and yet it's actually. you know, for those in the know, it's like it's even worse. It's the worst thing you can believe.
There's hilarious footage from a Red Dwarf convention where a kid stands up and asks, because they're all there, the cast are there on a panel, and this kid who's like 12 or something stands up and says, "What does smeg mean?"
Oh,
and they all just lose their fucking mind.
Oh God, that's so excruciating. God bless him.
Absolute brilliance.
But it is a little detail that's very truthful to me, because you do that in your home, don't you? You have funny little names for things, you know.
Yeah.
There's one that always sticks in my mind in the movie Witness. You know, the Harrison Ford goes and has to stay with the Amish for complicated plot reasons movie from the 80s. There's a bit where he takes the Amish woman and her kid, who he's looking after, to his sister's house. And they walk in, and he says to her, you know, is there somewhere they can stay? And she says, well, there's the blue room. And he says, oh yeah, the blue room. Like, that really struck me at the time as the sort of thing that I recognize from family life. You do have stuff like that, little names for things that are that struck me as a very authentic detail.
Yeah, I like that.
It happens, you know. You have these idiosyncratic names for a bit of furniture or a particular little room or whatever. And
in fact, it could be as innocent as the fact, you know, if photography was going on, that you know there is, you know, I've done it. That's the glory hole. That's where all the magic happens. When I, you know, that's when I develop my film and so on. But again, you know, they're running with the same metaphor about, you know, stop it, George. Stop
media, hidden things in the darkness that are media.
Exactly, and things appearing on in images that weren't there before.
The recording
through
and
chemical reactions,
reproduction of the image.
It just goes on and on and on, doesn't it? It is like they talk about it in terms of peeling the layers of an onion. You know, that's exactly what it is.
Like all the greatest texts, it's not a picture; it's a hall of mirrors. It's mirrors facing each other, so you get this endless.
The fact that there's a mirror facing the glory hole, actually, which then ends up, you know, basically knocking out a sound guy. I mean, you could read so much into that. Bloody hell! No, let's not go down that. Let's not.
The fact that the frightening thing becomes you're taking away the various things that the media has to even broadcast it shuts down one bit at a time. That's very that makes it such a good climax. It's an inversion of a climax almost. You know, it's like it's the silencing rather than.
I just love the fact you never find out what happens to Sarah Green.
No, she just disappears into this Stygian,
particularly as well, because she basically dominated television for about 15 years. Mostly children's television, but she didn't really do the leap that a lot of them did for whatever reason into the magazine programs of the of the quote unquote grown up audience. So we can only assume she's still in there. On a way, there's a sort of because she's for someone who was basically omnipresent. When I was growing up, Blue Peter, Saturday Superstore, Going Live, this, various other things, that they're nothing.
She's been absorbed into,
hasn't she? At this point,
she's been absorbed. She's haunting a little house in wherever it is. Wow.
But she had to appear. She had to appear, didn't she, on like CBBC the day after and say, "I'm fine. There's nothing. I'm okay."
But again, I think that's something that the BBC kind of knew it was doing. That. Sarah Green, that'll bring children over into watching this. It can't help but, because that's her audience. You know, why didn't they use Maggie Philbin or someone, or Judith Ham for this? No, seriously, they used a famous children's presenter.
She's got to deal with kids in the story. I think that's probably it.
So that is probably it. Yeah, you're probably right. But again.
And she does. Again, props to her. She has tremendous chemistry with the kids.
Well, she's brilliant.
Yeah, she does well.
But again, it's that thing of like, there's got to be some departmental meeting where some bod went, "Ooh, aren't we a bit worried that we might bring over the audience who follow her on Going Live or whatever onto the the fact that they either did and it was part of the whole, I wonder if we'll get away with this, or no we won't, or they just weren't thinking."
Wonderful.
Yeah, it's kind of.
I want a sequel, which is about sort of the ghost that now haunts that house. That row of houses has been knocked down, and it's now like a shopping, an out of town shopping extravaganza place or something, and it's haunted by a ghost that is kind of Sarah Green with the little girl and this Tunstall guy and the mother
and everything else. Yeah.
They run a tobacconist where they sell pipes. It's all heavily marketed around Tunstall.
Oh, what a horrible thought.
Yeah, so like the avatar, the corporate avatar, is his face with the gouged out eye.
Yeah, capitalism has robbed even that elemental evil of its power and its horror, and turned it into something you can package and sell.
Oh yeah.
That makes me want to vomit.
That's a great closing line. That makes me want to vomit.
Yes, that's our official sign off now.
Yeah, I think that must be me vomiting. Great.
Yeah. No, I tell you, but just to close, I'll say one thing, which is that I have cats, and if I die and they're locked in with me, they are more than welcome to eat my eyeballs.
Yeah,
it's fine.
It's fine. I'm not going to be using them at that point, so it's
just flash them your donor card before you bubble. At least it's consensual then.
Brilliant. Exactly. I mean, when I was watching it earlier, when the cat started to yell, my cat definitely.
Yeah. I had trouble here when that started. I had to turn the volume down because I had lots of ears pricked up and eyes open very wide. And what the fuck is that?
Yeah, I had that very much.
I had to reassure them it's all right. It's an acting cat. He's in equity. He's getting paid. It's fine.
Yeah, it's all right.
And I know they brought over someone from something else to do the sound design on it, which was really significant, and it's completely escaped my memory. So answers on a postcard, everyone, to Saturday Superstore, BBC. London W12 8QT. Ring 01 811 8055. This is all imprinted.
It was all such effort, wasn't it? It was all such effort to get in touch
on the back of a postcard.
Oh, how did anyone ever do it?
There you go.
There were some dedicated kids back then who wrote into Saturday morning shows and whatnot. I've got to say, because it took effort.
Oh God, yeah.
I am just determined to talk to Philip Schofield. If it takes me all fucking morning, I'm going to do this.
I did.
I'd like to have a word with Philip Schofield now, I tell you.
Yeah. Oh boy, yeah. Maybe with one hand around the scruff of his neck. Yeah. But I did get the lyrics to Around the World in 80 Days with Willie Fogg. I did send off for that. Yes. Yeah. They're somewhere. God. They're somewhere in my parents' attic or something.
Okay. It's getting silly now. I'm calling a close to this.
We're getting into lions with top hats territory, so it's fine.